The door slammed shut, and the lock clicked twice. Elena Voss pressed her palms against the cold wood, listening to Marla's footsteps fade down the hallway. 3 days. That was how long she had been told she would stay in this small storage room behind the kitchen, with nothing but a cracked jug of water and a single candle that had already burned halfway down. "You will learn your place before the ball," Marla had said, her voice flat and without anger, which was somehow worse than shouting. "A servant does not dance beside kings." Elena sank onto the pile of old blankets in the corner, pulling her knees to her chest. Her stomach had already begun to twist with hunger, though it had only been a few hours since her last meal, a thin bowl of broth that Diana had spat into before handing it to her. She had eaten it anyway. Pride did not fill an empty stomach. Through the thin wall, she could hear Nora and Diana laughing in the room next door, their voices bright with excitement as they tried on gowns for the mating ball, the event that every unmated she-wolf in the kingdom had been summoned to attend, where the Alpha King himself would search the crowd for the scent of his fated mate. Elena had heard the rumors for weeks. Cale Ashbourne, ruler of the Ashbourne Pack and Alpha King over every territory in the north, had reached his 28th year without finding his mate. His advisors grew anxious. A king without a mate was a king without an heir, and a kingdom without an heir was a kingdom vulnerable to challenge. So the ball had been called, every pack ordered to send their eligible daughters, and refusal was not something any pack dared consider. Marla had no intention of sending Elena as a guest. She would send her as a servant, dressed in rags, carrying trays and refilling cups while Nora and Diana danced in silk. It did not matter to Marla that Elena was, by blood, still a daughter of the Voss pack, the only child of Edmund Voss before his death 3 winters ago. What mattered to Marla was control, and Elena's presence at the ball as anything other than a servant threatened that control. Elena had once believed that grief would soften Marla, that losing a husband might draw the household closer together. Instead, grief had hardened into resentment, and resentment had found its easiest target in the quiet, obedient girl who reminded Marla of the man she claimed to still love, but had never truly wanted. There had been a time, in the earliest months following Edmund's death, when Marla's cruelty had still been subtle enough to mistake for grief. A missed meal here, a sharp word there, easily explained away as the natural consequence of a household adjusting to loss. It was only gradually, season by season, that the pattern had revealed itself for what it truly was, deliberate and calculated, rather than born of genuine sorrow, and by the time Elena had fully understood the shape of what was happening to her, she had already lost whatever standing or voice she once possessed to challenge it. The candle sputtered. Elena watched the flame lean sideways in a draft that came from beneath the door, and she thought about the last time her father had held her, the last time anyone had looked at her like she mattered. 3 winters was a long time to be nothing. She remembered her father's study, the smell of aged parchment and cedar smoke, the way he used to lift her onto his shoulders so she could reach the highest shelves of his library. Edmund Voss had been a firm leader, but a gentle father, the kind of man who listened carefully when his daughter spoke, who treated her opinions as though they carried weight, even when she was only a small child, chattering about nothing in particular. He had promised her, more than once, that she would grow into a woman capable of leading the pack herself one day, should she wish it. That promise had died with him. A hunting accident, the healers had said, though Elena had never fully believed the story Marla told about how it happened. Within a month of his burial, Marla had rearranged the entire household, moving Elena from her childhood chambers into a smaller room near the servants' quarters, explaining that the larger rooms needed to be prepared for guests who never seemed to arrive. Within a year, the smaller room had become the storage closet itself, and Elena had stopped questioning the slow, deliberate erosion of everything that had once belonged to her. She thought sometimes about running, about slipping out through the kitchen door in the dead of night, and simply walking, until she found somewhere, anywhere, that might offer a different life. But she had no coin, no allies beyond the estate walls, and no certainty that the world beyond Marla's household would treat an unmated, penniless she-wolf with any more kindness than she currently received. Fear of the unknown had always outweighed the misery of the familiar, and so she had stayed, season after season, telling herself that endurance was its own quiet form of victory. A soft scratching sound came from beneath the door, and Elena tensed instinctively before recognizing the small shape of a mouse slipping through the gap, drawn perhaps by the faint smell of the breadcrumbs Bettina had left behind. She watched it for a while, oddly comforted by its presence. Another small creature simply trying to survive within walls that offered little mercy to anyone. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing in this house. Instead, she closed her eyes and reached inward, toward the quiet, sleeping presence of her wolf. Her second self had always been small, gentle, more inclined to curl up and wait than to fight. But even wolves need food to survive, and Elena had been given less and less of it as the days passed. By the second day locked in the storage room, her hands had begun to tremble. She measured the water carefully, one small sip every few hours, because she did not know exactly how long Marla intended to keep her there. She heard servants pass by outside, carrying trays of roasted meat and fresh bread toward the dining hall, the smell curling under the door and settling in her empty stomach like a cruel joke. On the second night, someone knocked softly on the door. Elena sat up, hope flickering despite herself. Elena? It was old Bettina, one of the kitchen servants who had worked for the Voss family since before Elena was born. Her voice was low, careful. "I brought you something. Don't let her know." A folded cloth slid beneath the door. Inside was a small heel of bread and a strip of dried meat. Elena's hands shook as she unwrapped it, grateful tears finally rising to her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the shock of unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she whispered through the crack in the door. "You don't need to thank an old woman for doing what any decent soul would do," Bettina added quietly. "I remember your father, Elena. I remember how proud he was of you, how he used to boast to other pack leaders about his clever, kind-hearted daughter. He would not recognize this house anymore, and he certainly would not recognize how you've been treated within it." "Please don't get caught because of me," Elena whispered. "I couldn't bear it if you lost your position over something like this." "I've served this family for 18 years, Bettina replied. "I helped prepare your father's rites with my own hands. I am not afraid of Marla Voss, not truly. I simply have to be careful, for your sake more than mine. If she suspects I'm helping you, she may find new ways to make things harder." "Eat slowly," Bettina murmured. "I have to go before she notices I'm gone." The footsteps retreated, and Elena allowed herself the smallest smile as she broke off a piece of the bread. It was not much, but it was enough to keep her wolf from slipping into full starvation, enough to remind her that not everyone in this house had lost their humanity. The bread lasted her through the third day, rationed into tiny pieces, chewed slowly, to make the meal last longer in her mind, if not in her stomach. By the time the door finally opened on the morning of the ball, Elena was weaker than she had ever been in her life, her limbs heavy, her thoughts slow and foggy at the edges. Marla stood in the doorway, arms crossed, examining her with the same cool detachment she might use to inspect a piece of furniture. "Good, you look appropriately humble." "I need to eat something before tonight," Elena said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "You'll eat when the work is done." Marla tossed a folded gray dress onto the floor at Elena's feet. It was the same dress the servants wore, plain and undyed, patched at the hem. "Wear this. You'll be assisting with the refreshments tonight. Stay near the kitchen entrance. Do not speak to any of the guests unless spoken to, and even then, keep your eyes down." Elena picked up the dress with trembling fingers. She wanted to argue, wanted to remind Marla that she was still a daughter of this pack, that her father's blood ran through her veins just as surely as it had once run through the halls of this house when he was alive to protect her. But arguing had never worked before, and she doubted it would work now, not with her body this weak, and her voice this quiet. She dressed slowly, each movement costing more effort than it should have. When she finally stood, the room tilted slightly, and she had to press a hand against the wall to steady herself. Hunger had become a constant companion these past 3 days. A hollow ache that no longer announced itself with sharp pains, but instead sat heavy and dull beneath her ribs. Down the hall she caught a glimpse of Nora and Diana preparing for the evening. Nora wore deep blue silk that matched her eyes, her hair twisted into an elaborate braid studded with small pearls. Diana's gown was a rich burgundy, cut to show off the confidence she carried like a second skin. They looked beautiful, and they looked entitled to that beauty, the way people look when they have never once had to question their place in the world. "You're still here?" Diana asked, catching sight of Elena in the hallway. She did not bother to hide her amusement. "I thought Mother would keep you locked up until after we returned." "She has work for me tonight," Elena said quietly. "Of course she does. Diana's smile was sharp. Try not to trip while you're carrying the trays. It would be embarrassing for all of us if the servant girl made a scene in front of the king. Elena said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not simply give Diana more satisfaction, and she had learned to conserve her energy, both physical and emotional, for the moments that mattered. The carriage ride to the Ashbourne Palace took nearly 2 hours, though Elena did not ride inside the carriage with her stepfamily. She traveled instead with the other servants in a smaller, plainer wagon that jostled over every rut in the road, each bump sending a fresh wave of dizziness through her already unsteady body. She kept her eyes closed for most of the journey, focusing on simply staying upright, staying conscious, staying functional enough to survive whatever the night demanded of her. She counted her own breaths as a way of anchoring herself against the nausea, a small technique she had developed over the years whenever her hunger grew sharp enough to threaten her composure entirely. In, slowly, hold, release. It rarely eliminated the discomfort, but it gave her something to focus on besides the growing weakness spreading through her limbs, something small and controllable, in a life that had offered her so very little control over anything else. By the time they arrived, the sun had already begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet behind the towering spires of the Ashbourne Palace. Elena had never seen anything like it. The palace rose from the hillside like something carved from a single piece of pale stone, its windows glowing gold with candlelight, its grounds alive with the scent of 100 different packs gathered from across the kingdom. Wolves of every station moved toward the entrance, in waves of silk and velvet, laughter and anticipation thick in the air. Somewhere among them, Elena knew, walked the daughters of noble packs, who had spent weeks preparing for this night, hoping against hope that they might be the one whose scent called to the Alpha King's wolf. She caught fragments of conversation as the servants' wagon rolled past groups of arriving guests, breathless speculation about which pack might finally produce the king's mate, about the rumored fortune that awaited whichever family secured such an alliance. None of it concerned her. She was not among the hopeful daughters dressed in silk, adjusting jewelry and practicing curtsies. She was cargo, delivered alongside crates of extra linens and barrels of wine, expected to disappear into the background the moment her duties began. The wagon driver, an older man named Colm, who had worked for the Voss estate almost as long as Bettina, glanced back at Elena more than once during the journey, concern etched plainly across his weathered face. "You don't look well, miss," he said quietly, careful to keep his voice low enough that the other servants riding alongside them would not overhear. "Are you certain you're fit to work tonight?" "I don't have a choice," Elena said simply, and Colm's expression tightened with something that looked remarkably like helpless anger, though he said nothing further, understanding as well as anyone within the household exactly how little power existed to change Marla's decisions. Elena was directed toward a side entrance, down a narrow servants' corridor that smelled of polished wood and distant perfume. A stern-faced woman with a clipboard assigned her to the refreshment table nearest the ballroom's western wall, instructing her to keep the trays filled and to remain out of sight as much as possible. "Understood," Elena murmured, though her vision had begun to blur slightly at the edges, the room tilting whenever she turned her head too quickly. The kitchens behind the ballroom buzzed with frantic activity, dozens of cooks and servers moving in practiced coordination as they prepared for what was clearly the largest event the palace had hosted in years. Elena caught glimpses of roasted pheasant and towering pastries, of wine casks being tapped and silver trays polished to a blinding shine, each sight making her stomach clench with a hunger she could no longer ignore, no matter how firmly she tried to focus on her assigned duties instead. She took her place behind the long table, arranging small glasses of wine and delicate pastries with hands that did not feel entirely her own. The ballroom beyond was already filling with guests, their voices rising into a low, constant hum of excitement. Chandeliers blazed overhead, throwing warm light across polished marble floors, and somewhere at the far end of the hall, Elena caught her first glimpse of the raised dais where the king would eventually appear. Her stomach twisted, not from hunger this time, but from a strange, unfamiliar anticipation. She did not know why. She had no expectation of being noticed tonight, no hope of standing among the daughters vying for the king's attention. She was simply a servant, invisible in her gray dress, tasked with keeping glasses full until the night ended, and she could finally return home to whatever meager meal Marla decided to allow her. But as the hours passed, and the ballroom grew more crowded, Elena found it increasingly difficult to stay upright. The weakness that had been building for 3 days now pressed down on her with new urgency, and the mingled sense of perfume and wine and roasting meat, meant to be delightful, made her stomach lurch instead. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing slowly, trying to steady herself before anyone noticed. "Are you well?" a young page asked, pausing beside her with a tray of empty glasses. "I'm fine," Elena said, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. "Just tired." The page shrugged and moved on, unconcerned, and Elena forced herself to straighten, to blink away the strange darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. Somewhere in the ballroom, trumpets began to sound, a bright, ceremonial fanfare that rippled through the crowd and silenced the chatter almost instantly. The sudden hush felt strange after hours of constant noise, the clink of glasses and murmur of conversation, replaced by an expectant stillness that seemed to settle over every corner of the vast hall. Even the servants along the refreshment tables straightened slightly, drawn by instinct toward the grand entrance, where the Alpha King was expected to appear at any moment. The Alpha King was about to arrive. Elena's pulse quickened, despite her exhaustion, some instinct she could not name, urging her to look toward the dais, to watch the doors at the far end of the hall. She told herself it was simple curiosity, the same curiosity that gripped every soul in the room. She did not yet understand that her body was responding to something far older and far stronger than curiosity, a pull that had nothing to do with rank or duty, and everything to do with fate. The great doors swung open, and a hush fell over the entire ballroom. Elena's vision swam, the room tilting sharply to one side. She reached for the table to steady herself, but her fingers found only air. The last thing she registered before the darkness finally claimed her was the sound of hundreds of voices gasping at once, and beneath that sound, faint and strange, something that felt almost like recognition, calling to her from across the crowded hall. Then the floor rushed up to meet her, and Elena Voss knew nothing more. The gasp that swept through the ballroom was not for the collapsed servant girl lying on the marble floor. It was for the king himself, who had gone utterly still in the doorway, his golden eyes fixed on the fallen figure across the room as though nothing else existed. Cale Ashbourne had walked into countless rooms in his life expecting nothing more than the usual parade of hopeful daughters and anxious pack leaders. He had grown numb to the ritual of it, the perfumed air, the calculated smiles, the way every eligible she-wolf seemed to angle herself just so, hoping to catch his eye. He had expected tonight to be no different. Another ball, another disappointment, another reminder that the mate bond he had waited 28 years to feel might never come at all. Then the scent hit him. It arrived like a wave crashing against stone, faint at first, beneath the layers of perfume and wine, but unmistakable once his wolf recognized it. Wildflowers after rain, something warm and clean and achingly familiar, though he had never encountered it before in his life. His wolf surged forward inside him, with a force that nearly buckled his knees, a single word echoing through his mind, with absolute certainty. Mate. He turned his head, following the scent through the crowded hall, and that was when he saw her falling. A girl in a plain gray servant's dress, her body crumpling toward the floor, as though her legs had simply forgotten how to hold her upright. Every instinct in Cale's body screamed at once. He moved before he had even consciously decided to, cutting through the startled crowd with a speed that sent nobles stumbling out of his path, silk skirts scattering like startled birds. He reached her just as her head would have struck the unforgiving marble, sliding to his knees and catching her against his chest, with an urgency that surprised even his own guards. Around him, the crowd had frozen entirely. Hundreds of nobles caught between shock at the king's sudden, undignified sprint across the ballroom floor, and confusion over the identity of the collapsed girl in gray. Whispers began rising almost immediately, quiet at first, then swelling as guests strained to see over one another's shoulders, desperate not to miss whatever remarkable thing was unfolding before them. "Get the healer," he barked, his voice carrying easily over the stunned silence of the ballroom. "Now." He looked down at the girl in his arms, and his wolf howled with a mixture of relief and fury. She was pale, far too pale, her skin cool to the touch in a way that spoke of more than simple exhaustion. Her cheekbones stood out sharply beneath skin stretched thin, and when he pressed two fingers gently to her wrist, He could feel her pulse fluttering weak and unsteady beneath his touch. "She's starving," he said, low and dangerous, though he was not entirely certain who he was speaking to. His golden eyes swept the crowd, searching for anyone who might explain how a girl could arrive at his palace in this condition. "Someone tell me who brought her here." Silence answered him, thick and uncomfortable. Somewhere near the refreshment table, a woman in deep burgundy silk shifted uneasily, her eyes darting toward the exit, as though she might slip away unnoticed. Cale's gaze caught the movement immediately, and something in his expression made her freeze in place. "You," he said, nodding toward her. "Come here." Diana Voss approached slowly, her earlier confidence replaced by a wariness that had not been there moments before. Beside her, Nora hovered uncertainly, and further back, near the edge of the crowd, Marla Voss stood with her chin lifted, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of alarm. "Do you know this girl?" Cale asked, his voice deceptively calm. "She's our servant," Diana said carefully. "She works in our household." "Her name," Cale said, each word clipped with restrained anger. "Elena," Marla answered from the crowd, stepping forward with practiced composure. "Elena Voss, she's my late husband's daughter, Your Majesty. A troubled girl, prone to fainting spells. I apologize for the disruption she's caused this evening." Cale's eyes narrowed, and something in his chest tightened painfully at the casual dismissal in Marla's tone, the way she spoke of Elena as though she were an inconvenience rather than a person. He had spent 28 years waiting for the moment his wolf would recognize its mate, and now that moment had arrived wrapped in the unmistakable evidence of neglect, and the woman responsible stood before him, offering excuses instead of concern. He thought of every story he had heard growing up about the mate bond, tales passed down through generations of Ashbourne kings, describing the moment of recognition as pure joy, overwhelming relief after years of quiet searching. No one had ever warned him the discovery might arrive wrapped in grief instead, that his wolf's triumphant recognition might be answered almost immediately by a snarl of protective fury at the condition in which his mate had been found. He had imagined this night countless times, and never once had those imaginings included cradling a starved, unconscious woman, while her own family offered excuses in place of shame. "Your husband's daughter," he repeated slowly. "And yet she arrives at my palace, dressed as a servant, half-starved, collapsing the moment she crosses my threshold. Explain that to me, Lady Voss." Marla's composure flickered, just for a moment, before she recovered. "She prefers to keep to herself, Your Majesty. I assure you, whatever condition she's in is not a reflection of our household. Perhaps she simply forgot to eat, in her excitement over the evening." The lie hung in the air, thin and obvious, and Cale felt his wolf snarl with contempt at the sound of it. He had spent enough years ruling to recognize deception when it was offered to him so plainly, and the sight of Elena's frail body against his chest told a story far more truthful than anything Marla Voss had to say. The healer arrived then, an older woman named Odette, her silver hair pulled back in a tight knot, her healing bag already open in her hands. She knelt beside Cale, pressing gentle fingers to Elena's throat, her brow furrowing with concern as she worked. "Her pulse is weak," Odette murmured. "Blood sugar's dangerously low, and she's dehydrated. This didn't happen overnight, Your Majesty. This girl has been without proper food for days, possibly longer." "Days," Cale repeated, his voice dropping into something colder than the marble floor beneath them. "At least 3, by the look of her," Odette confirmed. "We need to get her somewhere quiet, and we need to begin treatment immediately. Broth first, nothing heavy, and fluids. Her body needs time to recover before she can handle solid food." Odette had served as royal healer for over 2 decades, treating everything from minor training injuries to the aftermath of border skirmishes, but rarely had she seen a case of deliberate, sustained deprivation quite this severe within a noble household. She kept her professional composure as she worked, but her eyes carried a flinty anger of their own each time she glanced toward the cluster of Voss women still standing near the refreshment table, their earlier finery suddenly looking considerably less impressive against the backdrop of what their household had apparently allowed to happen. Cale did not wait for further instruction. He gathered Elena more securely against his chest and rose to his feet in one fluid motion, cradling her as though she weighed nothing at all, though he could feel every point where her bones pressed too closely against her skin. Somewhere behind him, he could hear the muffled sound of Marla attempting to explain herself further to a cluster of nearby nobles, her voice pitched lower now, clearly working to salvage what remained of her standing among witnesses who had already drawn their own conclusions. The ballroom remained utterly silent, hundreds of eyes watching the Alpha King hold a servant girl as though she were made of glass. "This ball is concluded," Cale announced, his voice ringing clearly through the hall. "I have found my mate." A stunned pack leader near the front of the crowd began to speak, then thought better of it, closing his mouth again under the weight of Cale's fierce, unwavering expression. No one else dared interrupt the king's declaration, the entire hall seeming to hold its collective breath as the full implications of his words settled over the gathered court. The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers erupting in every direction as nobles turned to one another in disbelief. A servant girl, the daughter of a minor pack, dressed in rags, found unconscious on the ballroom floor. It was not the story anyone had expected when they arrived tonight, and Cale could see the calculations already forming behind dozens of watching eyes, the sudden reassessment of a girl they had all overlooked only moments before. Several of the noble daughters who had spent weeks preparing for tonight exchanged glances of poorly concealed disappointment, their carefully arranged gowns and rehearsed introductions suddenly rendered meaningless. Others simply stared, wide-eyed, at the spectacle of their king carrying an unconscious servant girl through the parted crowd with a tenderness none of them had ever witnessed from him before. A few, more perceptive than the rest, began already calculating what this unexpected turn might mean for their own family's standing, whether alliance with the newly elevated Voss name might yet prove advantageous, despite its humble circumstances. He did not care. His wolf cared for nothing but the fragile weight in his arms, and the fury building steadily beneath his calm exterior, at the thought of what she must have endured to arrive at his palace in this condition. "Your Majesty," Marla began, stepping forward with sudden urgency, "surely there's been some misunderstanding. Elena is a sweet girl, but she's hardly suited to—" "Careful, Lady Voss." Cale's voice cut through her words like a blade, quiet, but unmistakably lethal. "You are speaking about the future queen of this kingdom. I would think carefully about how you choose to finish that sentence." Marla's mouth snapped shut, her face draining of color as the full weight of the situation settled over her. Beside her, Diana and Nora exchanged a look of pure disbelief, their earlier mockery of Elena now curdling into something closer to panic. Cale turned away from them without another word, carrying Elena through the parted crowd, toward the private corridors that led deeper into the palace. Ronan, his beta and closest advisor, fell into step beside him, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes carried a wealth of unspoken questions. "You're certain?" Ronan asked quietly, once they were beyond the hearing of the assembled nobles. "The bond is confirmed?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Cale replied, glancing down at Elena's pale face, at the dark lashes resting against her cheeks, at the faint furrow between her brows even in unconsciousness, as though even now, some part of her remained braced against hardship. "Find out everything about the Voss household. Everything. I want to know exactly what happened to her, and I want to know before she wakes. And the stepmother? She stays under watch until I decide what to do with her." Cale's jaw tightened. "No one starves my mate," and walks away as though nothing happened. Ronan studied his king carefully, noting the tension coiled through his shoulders, the barely restrained fury simmering beneath his outward composure. In the years he had served as Cale's beta, he had rarely seen him this affected by anything, and certainly never this quickly. "The court is already talking," Ronan said carefully. "Word travels fast, in a room full of nobles, with nothing better to do than speculate. By morning, every pack in the kingdom will know a servant girl collapsed at your feet, and you declared her your mate, before she'd even opened her eyes." "Let them talk," Cale said again, echoing the sentiment that would soon become something of a refrain for him in the days ahead. "I care considerably more about what condition she's in than what conclusions the court draws from tonight's events." Ronan nodded and peeled away, already moving to gather the guards who would begin the investigation. Cale continued down the corridor alone, Elena's weight familiar against his chest already, as though his body had simply always known this was where she belonged. Odette hurried ahead of him, directing servants to prepare a private chamber near the king's own rooms, the fireplace already being lit, blankets and warm broth summoned with an urgency that spoke of the healer's genuine alarm. Cale laid Elena gently upon the bed, and for a long moment, he simply stood there, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, memorizing the details of a face he somehow already felt he had known for years. "She'll wake soon," Odette said softly, checking Elena's pulse once more. "Her body is exhausted, but she's stable now. With proper care, she'll recover fully within a few weeks." "Weeks," Cale murmured, more to himself than to the healer. He thought of Elena collapsing in the ballroom, of the casual cruelty in Marla's voice, of the years this girl must have endured before tonight ever brought her to his door. Weeks to heal her body. He wondered how long it might take to heal whatever had been broken inside her long before hunger ever touched her bones. He pulled a chair close to the bedside and sat down, unwilling to leave her side even for a moment, and settled in to wait for the woman his wolf had already claimed as its own, to finally open her eyes. Elena's eyes fluttered open to the soft glow of firelight dancing across an unfamiliar ceiling, and for a long, disoriented moment, she could not remember where she was, or how she had come to be lying in a bed so soft it felt like sinking into a cloud. The last thing she remembered was the ballroom, the trumpets, the terrible tilting sensation, as the floor rushed up to meet her. She turned her head slightly, and her breath caught in her throat. A man sat in a chair beside the bed, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him, his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her weakness. He was unlike anyone she had ever seen, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that somehow made him look both regal and dangerously untamed. She did not need to be told who he was. Everyone in the kingdom knew the face of the Alpha King, even if she had never expected to see it this close, or under circumstances quite this strange. "You're awake," Cale said softly, and something in his voice carried a warmth that confused her more than the sight of him did. Kings did not speak to servants with tenderness. "Your Majesty," Elena whispered, struggling to push herself upright, though her arms trembled with the effort, and gave out almost immediately. Cale's hand shot out to steady her shoulder, gentle but firm, guiding her back against the pillows. "Don't strain yourself. You've been through enough tonight." He reached for a cup on the bedside table, one filled with warm broth that smelled richer and more comforting than anything Elena had eaten in days. "Odette says you need to eat slowly. Small sips, nothing more for now." Elena stared at the cup, then at the king holding it out to her with his own hands, and confusion warred with the desperate hunger still gnawing at her stomach. "I don't understand," she said. "Why am I here? Why are you—" "Drink first," Cale said gently. "Questions after." She hesitated only a moment longer before accepting the cup, her fingers trembling as she brought it to her lips. The broth was warm and savory, and the moment it touched her tongue, she had to fight back the urge to drink it all at once, some instinct warning her that her body was not ready for that yet. She sipped slowly, as instructed, and felt a small measure of strength returning to her limbs with each careful swallow. It struck her, somewhere in the middle of that slow, careful meal, how strange it felt to be watched so attentively while eating, without judgment or impatience, without the fear that finishing too slowly or too quickly might invite criticism. Marla had always monitored her portions with a kind of clinical precision, ensuring Elena never received quite enough to feel satisfied. Cale watched her now with something entirely different in his eyes, patient concern rather than calculated restriction, and the difference unsettled her almost as much as it comforted her. Cale watched her drink with an expression she could not quite read, something between relief and restrained anger simmering just beneath the surface. When she finally lowered the cup, exhausted from even that small effort, he took it from her hands and set it aside. "Elena Voss," he said, testing her name aloud, as though committing it to memory. "Do you know what happened tonight, at the ball?" "I fainted," she said quietly, embarrassment flushing warm across her cheeks, despite her weakened state. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I didn't mean to disrupt the celebration. If you'll allow me, I can return home once I've recovered enough to—" "You're not going anywhere," Cale interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "Elena, when I walked into that ballroom tonight, I recognized something the moment I caught your scent, something I've been waiting 28 years to feel." He paused, watching her carefully, gauging how much she already understood. "You are my mate." The words landed with the force of a physical blow, and Elena stared at him, certain she had misheard, or that hunger and exhaustion had finally driven her to some strange delusion. "That's not possible," she said. "I'm no one. I'm a servant in my stepmother's household. Mates are chosen among the daughters of great packs, Not among girls who scrub floors and carry trays. Mates aren't chosen at all, Kale said gently. That's the part most people misunderstand. Pack leaders arrange marriages between suitable families all the time, and those unions can certainly bring happiness and stability. But a true mate bond isn't arranged by anyone, not even by the two people it connects. It exists before either of us has any say in the matter, woven into something far older than politics or wealth or reputation. I didn't choose you because of your circumstances, Elena. My wolf recognized yours the instant your scent reached him, long before either of us knew anything meaningful about the other. Elena absorbed this slowly, the concept still foreign and difficult to fully accept after a lifetime spent believing herself unworthy of any particular notice. It still feels impossible, she admitted, like something meant for someone else's story, not mine. The bond doesn't care about status, Kale said, leaning forward slightly. It doesn't care about wealth or rank or the clothes someone wears to a ball. It recognizes something deeper, something neither of us controls. My wolf knew you the instant I smelled you across that room, and nothing about your circumstances changes that truth. He paused, considering how best to explain something he himself had only ever understood in the abstract, through stories passed down from his father and grandfather rather than personal experience. I used to imagine, growing up, what it might feel like when the bond finally revealed itself. I pictured it as something clean and simple, an unmistakable moment of clarity. I never imagined it might arrive tangled together with anger and worry, that recognizing my mate might mean recognizing, in the same breath, exactly how much she had suffered before I ever had the chance to find her. Elena shook her head slowly, overwhelmed, her mind still foggy from hunger and shock in equal measure. But I collapsed. I embarrassed you in front of your entire court. You didn't embarrass me, Kale said, and his voice hardened with something colder now, something that made Elena instinctively press herself back against the pillows. What embarrassed me was learning that my mate had been starved for days before she ever set foot in my palace. What angers me is imagining how long this has been happening, and how many people stood by and allowed it. Elena's throat tightened, old habits of silence and self-protection rising up automatically. It's not as bad as it looks, she said quietly. Marla has had a difficult time since my father passed. She doesn't mean... Don't, Kale said, gentle but unyielding. Don't make excuses for her. Not to me, and not to yourself. I've already sent guards to investigate the Voss household. I intend to learn exactly what has been happening to you, and I intend to make certain it never happens again. A strange mixture of fear and relief washed through Elena at his words. Fear, because she had spent 3 years learning that speaking against Marla brought swift and painful consequences. Relief, because for the first time since her father's death, someone with actual power seemed prepared to stand between her and the woman who controlled her life. She studied Kale's face carefully, searching for any hint of the calculation she had grown so accustomed to detecting in Marla's expressions, any sign that his kindness might carry hidden conditions she had not yet discovered. She found none. Whatever this man wanted from her, it did not appear to be anything she recognized from her years of navigating Marla's careful manipulations, and that unfamiliarity left her feeling simultaneously hopeful and deeply uncertain. "Why do you care?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." Kale's expression softened, and he reached out, hesitating only a moment before gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face, his touch far more careful than his imposing size would have suggested possible. "The bond doesn't require me to know you yet," he said, "but I intend to. Every part of you. Your favorite foods, the things that make you laugh, the dreams you've had to bury beneath years of survival. I have every intention of learning who Elena Voss truly is, beneath everything that's been done to bury her." Elena's eyes stung with unexpected tears, and she looked away, unable to hold his gaze, without feeling as though something long guarded inside her might finally crack open. "I don't know how to be someone's mate," she admitted quietly. "I don't know how to be anyone's anything, except a servant." She thought, as she spoke, of the years spent anticipating Marla's moods before they fully formed, of learning to read Diana's sharp tongue and Nora's quiet complicity well enough to minimize her own suffering wherever possible. Every skill she had cultivated in that household had been about survival, about shrinking herself into whatever shape kept her safest from the next punishment. She had no practice whatsoever in simply existing as herself, unguarded and unafraid, and the prospect of learning to do so now, in front of an entire kingdom, felt almost as daunting as the years of hunger she had already endured. "Then we'll learn together," Cale said simply. "There's no rush, Elena. You need time to heal, time to rest, time to simply exist without fear for the first time in years. I'm not asking you to become a queen overnight. I'm asking you to let me take care of you, starting with something as simple as making sure you never go hungry again." The sincerity in his voice was almost harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Elena had built careful walls around herself these past 3 years, walls designed to withstand insults and neglect, walls that had never once needed to protect her against kindness. She did not know what to do with the warmth spreading through her chest at his words, the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being cared for by someone who expected nothing in return. She thought of the years spent believing herself unlovable, undeserving of gentle treatment, convinced by Marla's constant criticism that her own worth was tied entirely to her usefulness as a servant. Hearing Cale speak so plainly of wanting to know her, favorite foods and all, felt almost disorienting, like being offered a language she recognized the shape of, but had never actually been permitted to speak. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now, you rest," Cale said. "Odette will check on you through the night, and I'll be nearby if you need anything. Tomorrow, once you've regained some strength, we can discuss what comes next. But tonight, all I need from you is to sleep, and to trust that you're safe here." "And my step-family?" Something dark flickered across Cale's expression. "They will answer for what they've done, I promise you that. But that is a conversation for another day, when you're strong enough to face it, if you choose to face it at all. Tonight, you owe them nothing. Not your worry, not your fear, and certainly not your silence." Elena studied him for a long moment, this stranger who claimed to be bound to her by forces older than either of them, who had carried her from a ballroom floor, and now sat beside her bed, as though guarding something infinitely precious. She did not fully understand what was happening to her life, how drastically it had shifted, in the span of a single evening, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that almost resembled hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't need to thank me for basic decency," Cale said, though something in his eyes told her he understood exactly how rare basic decency had been in her life until now. "Rest now, Elena. I'll be here." The fire crackled softly in the hearth as she settled deeper into the pillows, the warmth reaching her in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after years of shivering through cold nights in the storage room. She had forgotten, somewhere along the way, how comforting simple warmth could feel, how much of her constant tension had come not merely from hunger, but from the persistent, low-grade cold that had seeped into her bones during those difficult years. She closed her eyes, and despite the strangeness of the day, despite the uncertainty of everything that lay ahead, she found sleep coming easier than it had in years, lulled by the quiet, steady presence of the king who had claimed her as his own, and by the unfamiliar, growing certainty that she was finally, truly safe. Somewhere near midnight, Odette returned quietly to check on Elena once more, pressing gentle fingers to her wrist and nodding with satisfaction at the steadier pulse she found there. "She's improving," the healer whispered to Cale. "Slowly but surely. The next few days will matter more than tonight did, Your Majesty. Her body needs consistent care, and so I suspect does whatever wounds lie beneath the surface that hunger alone didn't cause." "I intend to give her both," Cale replied quietly, and Odette studied him for a long moment before offering a small, approving nod and slipping back out into the corridor, leaving him alone once more, with his thoughts and the quiet, steady sound of Elena's breathing. Cale remained in his chair long after her breathing evened into the steady rhythm of sleep, watching the firelight play across her face, cataloging every detail of the woman his wolf had chosen. He thought of Marla's careless dismissal in the ballroom, of the healer's grim assessment of Elena's condition, of the 3 days locked away without proper food that had brought her to the brink of collapse. Whatever gentleness he had shown Elena tonight, he reserved none of it for the family that had done this to her. Ronan would have gathered enough information by morning to begin building a case, and Cale intended to ensure that Marla Voss and her daughters understood, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what it meant to have wronged the mate of the Alpha King. But that reckoning could wait until dawn. Tonight belonged to Elena, to her recovery, to the quiet beginning of whatever they might become together. Cale settled deeper into his chair, prepared to keep vigil through the night, unwilling to let her wake alone even once in a home that, from this moment forward, would always be hers. Morning light spilled through tall windows, when Ronan finally found Cale still seated beside Elena's bed, dark circles beneath his eyes but his posture as alert as ever. The beta had not slept either, having spent the hours since the ball combing through reports gathered from servants within the Voss household, some given willingly, others coaxed loose through careful, patient questioning. A tray of untouched breakfast sat cooling on a side table, evidence that Cale had ordered food for himself out of habit, but had been too preoccupied with watching over Elena to actually eat any of it. Ronan noted this with a small, knowing look but said nothing, understanding well enough by now the depth of his king's sudden, all-consuming focus on the woman sleeping peacefully in the bed beside him. "You need to see this," Ronan said quietly, gesturing toward the door. Cale glanced at Elena, still sleeping peacefully beneath warm blankets, before rising and following his beta into the corridor. "Tell me," Cale said, once they were far enough away that his voice would not disturb her rest. Ronan opened a leather folder, his expression grim. "It's worse than we thought. We spoke with 3 servants from the Voss estate, including a woman named Bettina, who has served the family for over a decade. According to her account, Elena has been treated as little more than unpaid labor since her father's death 3 years ago. Reduced rations, denied proper clothing, forced to sleep in a converted storage room rather than her original chambers." Cale's jaw tightened, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath the surface of his composure. "And the starving before the ball?" "Confirmed. Marla locked her in a storage closet for 3 days prior to the event, specifically to prevent her from attending, or to ensure she arrived too weak and humiliated to draw any attention. Bettina risked punishment to bring her small amounts of food, which likely kept her from a far more serious collapse." 3 years, Cale repeated, the words heavy and cold in his mouth. 3 years of this, and no one intervened. "The Voss pack is small, Your Majesty, and Marla has cultivated careful appearances. Publicly, she's presented herself as a grieving widow, raising 3 daughters alone. Few outside the household would have suspected the truth, and those who might have suspected had little power to act against her. The pack's small council," Ronan explained further, "had largely deferred to Marla's judgment in the years following Edmund's death, assuming a grieving widow deserved latitude in managing her own household affairs. No one had thought to question why the pack leader's own daughter lived in such visibly reduced circumstances, or if they had noticed, they had assumed, as outsiders so often did, that such matters were private family business best left undisturbed." Cale's hands curled into fists at his sides, his wolf snarling with a fury that demanded immediate action. What of Elena's inheritance? Her father was pack leader before his death. Surely there were assets, land, some provision made for his only daughter. Ronan hesitated. "That's the other matter I needed to discuss with you. Edmund Voss left a will, one that named Elena as his primary heir, entitled to the majority of pack assets upon reaching her 20th year, which occurred several months ago. Marla has been systematically diverting those assets, using forged documents and falsified accounts to funnel Elena's inheritance into her own name and the dowries of her daughters." "Tell me about Edmund Voss," Cale said, wanting to understand more fully the man whose absence had allowed this suffering to take root. "What kind of leader was he?" "Well respected by all accounts," Ronan said. "A fair pack leader, known for settling disputes without unnecessary bloodshed, well liked by those under his protection. His death was considered a genuine loss at the time, though few outside his household seemed to have paid close attention to what happened afterward. Marla presented herself convincingly as a grieving widow, determined to hold the family together, and most simply accepted that narrative without question." The revelation landed like ice water down Cale's spine. Not only had Marla starved and neglected Elena, she had stolen from her as well, methodically and deliberately, likely for years. "How much has she taken?" "Nearly everything," Ronan said quietly. "Elena should be one of the wealthiest unmarried women in this kingdom. Instead, she's been living as an unpaid servant in what is legally her own household." Ronan continued, his voice carefully measured, despite the grim nature of his report. "There's a pattern here, Your Majesty, one that suggests Marla planned this from very early on. Servants recall her requesting access to Edmund's financial records within days of the funeral. well before any formal mourning period had concluded. The forged documents themselves were prepared gradually, over more than a year, time to avoid drawing attention from the Pact's remaining council members. So this was never simple grief, curdling into resentment, Cale said slowly, understanding settling over him with cold clarity. This was calculated from the very beginning. It appears that way, Ronan confirmed. Whether she planned Edmund's death itself remains unclear, and I want to stress that nothing in our investigation suggests foul play beyond what the original healers reported. But everything that followed his death was deliberate, methodical, and specifically designed to strip Elena of everything she was entitled to, while maintaining enough appearance of respectability to avoid outside scrutiny. Cale turned away, pacing the length of the corridor, in an effort to control the rage building inside him. He had ruled long enough to witness cruelty in many forms, ambitious pack leaders willing to sacrifice their own for power, families torn apart by greed and jealousy. But something about the calculated, sustained nature of what Marla had done to her own stepdaughter struck him with particular fury, precisely because it had been hidden so carefully behind a mask of respectable grief. "I want everything documented," Cale said finally, turning back to face Ronan. "Every falsified record, every witness statement, every piece of evidence you can gather. I intend to see Marla Voss and her daughters answer fully for what they've done, both to Elena's body and to her inheritance." He thought of his own mother, long past now, who had raised him with the constant reminder that true strength lay in protecting those without power to protect themselves. She would have been horrified, he knew, at the thought of a daughter treated so cruelly within her own household, and something in that memory hardened his resolve even further, a determination to see this matter through with the same thoroughness he would apply to any threat against the kingdom itself. And in the meantime? In the meantime, they remain here, under guard, until the investigation concludes. I won't have them fleeing before justice is served, nor will I allow them anywhere near Elena while she recovers. Cale's expression turned thoughtful. Has Elena been informed about the inheritance? Not yet. We wanted your guidance on how best to proceed, given her fragile state. Cale considered this carefully. Elena had already absorbed so much in a single night: the shock of the bond, the abrupt upheaval of her entire existence, the discovery that she was now, unexpectedly, betrothed to the Alpha King himself. Adding the weight of a stolen inheritance, of years of calculated theft layered atop years of neglect, felt like more than she should carry before she had even had a proper meal. He remembered his own experience learning difficult truths about people he had trusted, years earlier, when a distant cousin had attempted to manipulate Pack succession through similarly forged documents. That betrayal had taught him the importance of allowing people time to absorb devastating news at their own pace, rather than forcing them to confront every painful detail all at once, simply because efficiency demanded it. Let her heal first, he decided. A few days, at minimum, before we burden her with the full scope of what's been done. She needs to feel safe before she can face the anger that truth is likely to bring. Ronan nodded, closing the folder. There's one more matter, Your Majesty. Word of last night's events has already begun spreading beyond the palace walls. By tomorrow, every pack in the kingdom will know that you've claimed your mate, and that she was found starving and unconscious at your own ball. The political implications are considerable. Cale allowed himself a humorless smile. Let them talk. Let every pack leader in this kingdom understand precisely what kind of behavior I consider unacceptable toward those under my protection. If Marla Voss believed her cruelty would remain hidden forever, she was gravely mistaken, and I intend to make certain her fate serves as a warning to anyone else who might consider treating a daughter, a servant, or anyone weaker than themselves with such contempt. He returned to Elena's chamber a short while later, finding her still asleep, her face peaceful, in a way it likely rarely was during her waking hours. He settled back into his chair, watching her breathe, thinking of the years of quiet suffering that had led her here. To this moment, to him. When Elena finally stirred awake near midday, she found Cale exactly where she had left him, though fresh clothes suggested he had at least stepped away briefly to attend to himself. She blinked slowly, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar softness of the bed, before memory returned in a rush. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the chamber, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the warm air, and for a moment, Elena simply lay still, absorbing the unfamiliar comfort of a room that smelled of fresh linen rather than damp stone, of a mattress that did not press uncomfortably against her ribs the way the old storage room's thin blankets always had. "You stayed," she said softly, surprise evident in her voice. "I told you I would," Cale replied, offering her a small smile. "How are you feeling?" Elena took a moment to assess herself, noting with quiet relief that the dizziness from the previous night had faded, replaced by a lingering weakness that felt manageable rather than overwhelming. "Better," she admitted. "Still tired, but better." "Good. Odette will bring more broth shortly, and if you tolerate it well, we can try something slightly more substantial by evening." Cale studied her carefully. "Elena, there's something I need to discuss with you when you're ready." Something in his tone made Elena's stomach tighten with unease. "What is it?" Cale hesitated, weighing how much to share before deciding that honesty, even difficult honesty, was owed to her from the very beginning of whatever they were building together. "My investigators have been speaking with servants from your household. What they've learned goes beyond what happened these past 3 days before the ball." Elena's expression shuddered slightly, old defensive instincts rising automatically. "It's not important. I've managed this long. I'll continue to manage." "You shouldn't have to manage," Cale said gently but firmly. "Elena, I know about the 3 years since your father's death. I know about the storage room, the reduced meals, the labor you've been forced into despite being, by blood and by law, a daughter of that household rather than a servant within it." Tears welled unexpectedly in Elena's eyes, and she looked away, embarrassed by how quickly they had risen. "I didn't think anyone would ever know," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone would care." "I care," Cale said simply, reaching for her hand and holding it carefully in his own. "And there's more, Elena. Your father left you an inheritance, a considerable one, as his primary heir. Your stepmother has spent the past 3 years diverting that inheritance for herself and your stepsisters." Elena's breath caught, shock rippling across her features. "That's not possible. Marla told me there was nothing left, that father's debts had consumed everything before his death." "She lied," Cale said quietly, "about all of it. You are entitled to wealth and standing you were never permitted to know existed, and I intend to see that theft corrected, alongside everything else she's done to you." Elena sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of the betrayal now laid bare before her. 3 years of hunger, of humiliation, of quiet servitude in a home that had legally belonged to her all along, engineered deliberately by a woman who had claimed to be family. She thought of all the times she had gone without proper meals, while Marla dined on the finest cuts of meat the estate could afford, all funded, she now understood, by wealth that had rightfully belonged to her all along. She thought of the threadbare dresses she had worn for years, patched and repatched, while Nora and Diana received new gowns each season. Every small deprivation she had quietly endured, believing it simply the unfortunate consequence of reduced family fortune, had in fact been a deliberate choice, made by a woman who had more than enough resources to treat her fairly, and had chosen cruelty instead. The tears that had threatened moments before finally spilled over, though whether from grief, anger, or some complicated mixture of both, even Elena could not entirely say. Cale did not attempt to stop her tears, or rush her through the moment. He simply held her hand, a steady, silent presence beside her, allowing her the space to feel the full weight of everything that had finally come to light, while making certain, through his quiet, unwavering presence, that she understood, beyond any doubt, that she would never have to face any of it alone again. Over the following days, Elena's strength returned steadily, each meal a little more substantial than the last, each night of undisturbed sleep restoring color to her cheeks and clarity to her thoughts. Odette monitored her progress closely, gradually introducing solid foods, gentle exercise, and short walks through the palace gardens, once Elena felt strong enough to venture beyond her chamber walls. Cale made certain to visit her every day, often multiple times, finding excuses to check on her recovery, even when Odette assured him she was progressing well. He brought her books from the palace library, small delicacies from the kitchens, and once, a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked himself from the garden's edge, an act so unexpectedly personal that Elena had stared at him in surprise for a long moment before accepting them with trembling hands. "You didn't need to do this," she had said, cradling the simple bouquet as though it were made of gold. "I wanted to," Cale had replied simply, and something in the sincerity of his answer had settled warmly in Elena's chest, a feeling she was still learning how to name. She pressed the flowers between the pages of one of the books he had brought her, wanting to preserve something so small and yet so significant, a token from a man who had every resource in the kingdom at his disposal and had still chosen to gather something himself, with his own hands, simply because he thought it might make her smile. It was such a small gesture, and yet it told her more about his character than any grand declaration could have managed. Cale Ashbourne, she was slowly realizing, measured his affection in quiet, consistent actions rather than sweeping proclamations, and something about that steady consistency felt far more trustworthy than the grand romantic gestures she had occasionally overheard servants gossiping about, in reference to other noble courtships. She began to understand, slowly, that Cale's kindness was not performance, not the calculated behavior of someone managing an unwanted obligation. He asked her questions and genuinely listened to her answers, remembered small details she mentioned only once, and adjusted his own habits to accommodate her comfort, without ever making her feel like a burden for needing accommodation at all. He began teaching her, in small, unhurried sessions each afternoon, the basic structure of the kingdom's governance, the relationships between allied pacts, the delicate balance of trade and territory that kept the realm functioning smoothly. Rather than overwhelming her with formal lectures, he wove these lessons into ordinary conversation, discussing a particular pack leader's history while they walked, or explaining the significance of a treaty while sharing a meal, allowing Elena to absorb the information gradually, rather than facing it as an intimidating wall of unfamiliar material all at once. "You're a patient teacher," she told him one afternoon, genuinely surprised by how much she had already learned without the process feeling burdensome. "I had a patient tutor myself, growing up," Cale said. "My own father believed that knowledge absorbed under pressure rarely sticks, while knowledge absorbed through genuine curiosity tends to last a lifetime. I'm simply passing along the same philosophy." On the 5th day of her recovery, strong enough now to walk unassisted through the garden paths, Elena found herself seated beside Cale on a stone bench overlooking a small pond, the afternoon sun warm against her skin, in a way that felt like a luxury she had nearly forgotten existed. She had spent the morning with Odette, undergoing a final thorough examination that confirmed her physical recovery was well underway, her strength returning steadily with each passing day. The relief of that news had left her feeling almost giddy, light in a way that had nothing to do with her still recovering body, and everything to do with the simple, novel sensation of being told, by someone with genuine expertise, that she was healing well, rather than being scolded for some perceived failure. "Can I ask you something?" she said, watching a pair of swans glide across the water's surface. "Anything," Cale replied. "Why me?" The question had been building in her for days, ever since she had first understood the nature of the mate bond that connected them. There were dozens of daughters from powerful packs at that ball, women trained since childhood to be queens. Why would fate choose someone like me? Cale considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know why the bond works the way it does, Elena. No one truly understands the mechanics of fate, not even the oldest packs with the longest histories. But I can tell you this. The bond doesn't measure worth by training or wealth or the circumstances of someone's birth. It recognizes something deeper, something that exists independent of all of that. But what if I'm not suited for this life? I don't know how to navigate court politics, or manage a household this size, or represent a kingdom in front of foreign dignitaries. Everything I know how to do involves scrubbing floors and carrying trays." Cale turned to face her fully, his expression thoughtful. "Do you know what struck me most, the first time I truly spoke with you after you woke? You apologized for the disruption you caused by collapsing, as though your own suffering was somehow an inconvenience to everyone around you. That instinct, to minimize your own needs, to worry more about others' comfort than your own survival, that isn't a flaw, Elena. Properly redirected, it's precisely the quality that makes for a compassionate ruler, someone who considers the well-being of her people before her own convenience." "That's a generous interpretation of years spent being told my needs didn't matter," Elena said quietly. "Perhaps," Cale acknowledged, "but generous or not, it happens to be true. I've watched nobles raised from birth with every privilege imaginable, who never once learned to consider anyone's comfort beyond their own. You learned compassion the hard way, through necessity rather than instruction, and that kind of understanding runs considerably deeper than anything taught in a classroom. Then you'll learn what you don't already know, The same way anyone learns anything new, Kale said. And the things you already know, resilience, patience, the ability to endure hardship without losing yourself entirely. Those are qualities I've watched grown queens struggle to develop, even after years of privilege. You already possess a strength most people in this palace couldn't begin to understand. Elena absorbed his words slowly, uncertain whether to fully believe them, though something in his steady, unwavering gaze made it difficult to dismiss his sincerity. I still feel like I'm dreaming, she admitted. Like I'll wake up any moment back in that storage room, and none of this will have actually happened. She glanced down at her own hands, still slightly thinner than they had once been despite weeks of steady nourishment, a lingering reminder of exactly how close she had come to a very different fate. Sometimes, in quiet moments like this one, the sheer improbability of her circumstances threatened to overwhelm her entirely, and she found herself needing small, concrete reassurances, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the solid presence of Kale beside her, simply to remind herself that this new life was, in fact, real. Kale reached over, taking her hand gently in his own. You're not dreaming, Elena. This is real, and it's only the beginning. I know trust doesn't come easily after everything you've endured, and I'm not asking you to hand it over all at once, but I intend to prove myself to you, every single day, for as long as it takes. Something shifted in Elena's chest at his words, a small crack forming in the careful walls she had built over years of disappointment and betrayal. She was not yet ready to fully trust the warmth spreading through her at his touch, the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being cherished rather than merely tolerated. But she found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she wanted to try. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path, and both turned to see Ronan approaching, his expression tense in a way that immediately put Elena on edge. Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, Ronan said, bowing slightly. But there's a matter requiring your immediate attention. The investigation into the Voss household has uncovered additional information, and Lady Voss has requested an audience, demanding to speak with you directly. Kale's expression hardened instantly, protective instinct flaring at the mention of Marla. What does she want? She claims the accusations against her are exaggerated, and she's requesting the opportunity to present her case before any formal judgment is rendered. Ronan glanced briefly at Elena, uncertainty flickering across his features. She's also requesting to see Elena, insisting there's been a misunderstanding between them that could be resolved privately. Elena's stomach tightened at the mention of Marla, old instincts of fear and obligation warring against the new strength she had begun to rebuild these past several days. Kale noticed the shift in her posture immediately, his hand tightening protectively around hers. You don't have to see her, he said quietly. Not unless you want to, and not until you feel strong enough to face her on your own terms. Elena considered this for a long moment, memories of 3 years of quiet suffering rising unbidden, alongside newer memories of stolen inheritance and calculated cruelty disguised as grief. Some part of her, the part that had spent years learning to shrink herself into invisibility, wanted nothing more than to avoid the confrontation entirely, to let Kale and his investigators handle everything while she remained safely tucked away within the palace walls. But another part of her, one that had been buried beneath years of neglect but had never entirely disappeared, felt something different stirring now. Anger, clean and clarifying, at the woman who had stolen years of her life, who had denied her basic dignity while claiming the mantle of grieving widow, who had believed, with apparent confidence, that Elena would never possess the power or the voice to challenge her. I want to see her, Elena said finally, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. But not privately. I want witnesses present. I want everything documented. I've spent 3 years being silenced in that house, and I won't be silenced again. Not here. Not now. Something flickered across Kale's expression, pride and fierce protectiveness intertwining in equal measure. Are you certain? I'm certain, Elena said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. Kale turned to Ronan. Arrange it. The Great Hall, tomorrow morning. I want the full court present, along with anyone Elena wishes to have by her side. Marla Voss will have her audience, but she'll answer for her actions in front of everyone, not in some private conversation designed to manipulate sympathy or minimize her crimes. Understood, Your Majesty. Ronan bowed again and departed, leaving Kale and Elena alone once more beside the quiet pond. Kale turned back to Elena, studying her face carefully. You don't have to prove anything to me, Elena. Your strength isn't measured by whether you choose to confront her or not. I know, Elena said softly, but I need to do this for myself. I've spent 3 years believing I had no power, no voice, no ability to change my own circumstances. I need to stand in that hall and prove to myself, more than to her, that I'm not that frightened girl anymore. Kale brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his golden eyes warm with something that looked remarkably like admiration. Then I'll stand beside you, every step of the way. That evening, as the sun set behind the palace towers, Elena sat quietly in her chamber, going over in her mind everything she wanted to say the following day. She thought of the years of silence she had maintained, the countless moments when she had swallowed her own hurt, rather than risk the consequences of speaking honestly. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, for the first time since her father's death, she intended to speak plainly, in front of witnesses who could not simply dismiss her words as the exaggerations of a difficult, willful girl. She practiced the words quietly to herself, testing how they felt on her tongue, adjusting her tone, until it carried the steady conviction she hoped to project, rather than the trembling uncertainty that still lingered beneath her newfound resolve. Bettina, who had been permitted to visit briefly that evening, found her rehearsing by candlelight, and offered a small, encouraging smile. You'll do wonderfully, Bettina said. You always had more strength in you than anyone in that household ever gave you credit for. I hope you're right, Elena replied softly, though something in Bettina's steady confidence helped settle the nervous energy building in her chest. Elena felt the last of her hesitation melt away beneath the steady certainty of his promise, and for the first time since arriving at the palace, she allowed herself to fully believe that whatever tomorrow brought, she would not face it alone, and she would not face it as a victim, but as a woman finally prepared to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. The great hall had never felt so crowded, or so silent. Every noble who had attended the mating ball had returned at the king's summons, filling the tiered seating along the walls. Their whispers hushed the moment Kale entered through the tall double doors, Elena walking steadily at his side. She wore a gown of deep green velvet, chosen carefully by the palace seamstresses to complement her recovering strength, her hair pulled back simply but elegantly. She did not look like the starving servant who had collapsed on the ballroom floor a week earlier. She looked like exactly what she was becoming, a woman standing on the threshold of claiming her rightful place. Marla Voss stood near the center of the hall, flanked by guards, her posture rigid with barely contained tension. Beside her, Nora and Diana huddled close together, their earlier confidence replaced by visible unease as they took in the sheer scale of the audience gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. As they walked the length of the hall, Elena caught sight of familiar faces scattered among the crowd, minor pack leaders who had once visited her father's estate when she was still a young girl, distant relations who had never once intervened on her behalf, despite surely knowing, at least in general terms, how her circumstances had changed since Edmund's death. She did not allow herself to dwell on their averted eyes and uncomfortable expressions. Today was not about relitigating every failure of intervention across the kingdom. Today was about the woman who had directly caused her suffering, and the daughters who had witnessed it without objection. Kale led Elena to a raised platform near the throne, close enough that she stood almost level with him, a deliberate choice meant to signal her status to everyone watching. He remained standing beside her rather than seating himself on the throne, a subtle gesture of solidarity that Elena noticed and appreciated more than words could easily express. Lady Voss, Kale began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. You requested this audience to address the accusations brought against you. You may speak. Marla lifted her chin, drawing on years of practiced composure. Your Majesty, I believe there has been a grave misunderstanding regarding the circumstances of my stepdaughter's upbringing. Grief affects families in complicated ways. Since my husband's passing, I have done my best to manage a difficult household under difficult circumstances. If Elena felt neglected, I deeply regret that. But I assure you, no cruelty was ever intended. No cruelty was intended, Kale repeated slowly. And yet my investigators have gathered testimony from 3 separate servants within your household, confirming that Elena was denied adequate food, forced to sleep in a converted storage closet rather than her own chambers, and locked away without proper meals for 3 days immediately preceding the mating ball. Do you deny these accounts? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Marla's face before she recovered her composure. Household discipline sometimes requires firm measures, Your Majesty. Elena has always been a difficult, willful girl, prone to exaggeration. I only ever sought to guide her toward a more humble, appropriate demeanor. Elena felt old fear rising at the familiar, dismissive tone in Marla's voice, the same careful reframing of cruelty as discipline that she had endured for 3 long years. But this time, standing in a hall full of witnesses, with Cale steady beside her, she found the fear did not overwhelm her the way it once had. She thought of every occasion these past 3 years, when that same tone had silenced her completely, when Marla's calm, reasonable-sounding excuses had made her own suffering feel exaggerated, almost imagined, until she had begun to doubt her own perception of events entirely. Standing here now, watching that same careful performance play out in front of witnesses who could see the evidence for themselves, Elena understood, with startling clarity, just how much power that quiet, controlled tone had once held over her, and how little of that power remained now that the truth stood exposed for everyone to examine. Discipline, Elena said, her voice quiet, but clear enough to carry through the silent hall, drawing every eye toward her. Is that what you called it, when you locked me in that storage room without water for hours at a time? When Diana spat in my food, and you did nothing? When you told me my own father's inheritance had vanished into debt, while you secretly signed it over to yourself? Marla's face drained of color, her earlier composure cracking visibly. Elena, please, we don't need to air private family matters in. We are well past private family matters, Elena interrupted, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. You made this public the moment you starved me, before sending me to a royal event, hoping I would either fail to attend at all, or humiliate myself so thoroughly that no one would ever question your version of events again. Murmurs rippled through the gathered court, and Cale allowed the moment to breathe, watching with quiet pride as Elena found her voice in front of the very people who had once overlooked her entirely. Ronan stepped forward then, presenting a stack of documents to the court scribe. Your Majesty, we have gathered substantial evidence confirming Lady Voss's systematic diversion of Elena Voss's rightful inheritance, including forged signatures, falsified account records, and testimony from the family's own solicitor, who has admitted, under formal questioning, to assisting in the fraudulent transfer of assets over the past 3 years. The court scribe read aloud several key passages from the gathered testimony, including a signed statement from Colm, the wagon driver, describing years of witnessed mistreatment he had felt powerless to report, and a separate account from a kitchen maid who had once been dismissed abruptly after questioning why Elena's portions had grown so consistently smaller than everyone else's in the household. Each account, read aloud in the solemn quiet of the great hall, added another layer of undeniable evidence to the picture, already forming in the minds of everyone present. Diana's composure finally shattered entirely. Mother, you told us everything was handled properly. You said Elena had no claim to any of it. Silence, Marla hissed, though the damage had already been done, her own daughter's shock and confusion visible to everyone in the hall. Whispers rippled through the assembled nobles at this exchange, several exchanging pointed glances that suggested the true extent of Marla's deception had surprised even those who had arrived expecting some measure of scandal. A few of the older pack leaders, who had known Edmund Voss personally during his lifetime, shook their heads with visible disgust, their earlier sympathy for Marla's supposed grief evaporating entirely in light of the mounting evidence against her. Cale's expression turned colder, more formal, the tone of a king rendering judgment rather than a man simply listening to testimony. Marla Voss, the evidence against you is extensive and thoroughly documented. You have committed fraud against your own stepdaughter, diverted her rightful inheritance for personal gain, and subjected her to sustained neglect and cruelty over a period of 3 years. These are not the actions of grief, nor of misguided discipline. They are calculated crimes against a member of your own household, one who was, at every point, entitled to your protection, rather than your exploitation. Marla's knees seemed to weaken slightly, though she remained standing through sheer force of will. Your Majesty, please, whatever punishment you deem appropriate for me, I ask that you spare my daughters. They knew nothing of the financial matters, and they are innocent of— Innocent, Elena said softly, though the word carried clearly through the hall. Diana mocked me daily. Nora watched and said nothing. Neither of them ever once tried to intervene, even when they knew I was being denied basic necessities in my own father's house. Nora's face flushed with shame, tears welling in her eyes, though she made no attempt to defend herself. Diana, however, straightened with sudden defiance. Elena watched Nora's silent tears with a strange mixture of lingering resentment and reluctant sympathy. Unlike Diana, Nora had never actively participated in the cruelties inflicted upon her, but her silence, her consistent refusal to intervene, even when she clearly recognized the wrongness of what was happening, had wounded Elena in its own quiet, insidious way. There was a particular kind of loneliness in being ignored by someone who witnessed your suffering and simply chose to look away, and Elena was not yet certain how she felt about the genuine remorse, now visible on her stepsister's face. We were children ourselves, following our mother's lead. You can't possibly hold us fully responsible for. You are 22 years old, Diana, Cale said, his voice sharp enough to silence her immediately. Old enough to understand right from wrong. Old enough to have made different choices at any point over these past 3 years. Complicity and cruelty is not erased by claiming ignorance after the fact. The hall fell silent again, waiting for the king's final judgment. Cale turned to Elena, his expression softening slightly as he addressed her directly. This is your family, Elena, whatever twisted form that took. I want your voice included in whatever consequences follow, not merely my own judgment imposed upon you without consultation. Elena considered this for a long moment, looking at the 3 women who had once controlled every aspect of her existence, who now stood exposed and diminished before the entire court. She thought of the storage room, the hunger, the years of quiet humiliation. She thought, too, of Bettina's small kindnesses, smuggled bread passed beneath a locked door, proof that even within that household, decency had not been entirely extinguished. I don't want revenge, Elena said finally, her voice steady. I want justice, and I want to be certain no one else in their care ever suffers as I did. Revenge would satisfy something small and bitter within me, perhaps, but it would not undo 3 years of hunger, and it would not teach anyone watching today anything meaningful about how power should actually be wielded. Justice, properly applied, might at least ensure this never happens again, to me or to anyone else. Marla should be stripped of all rank and authority over any household, and every asset stolen from my father's estate should be returned to me in full. As for Nora and Diana, she paused, glancing at the 2 sisters, noting Nora's genuine tears and Diana's still simmering defiance. Let them face separate consequences, according to their separate choices. Nora's silence was cowardice, but Diana's cruelty was deliberate. They should not share identical punishment for unequal crimes. Cale studied her for a long moment, clearly impressed by the careful, measured wisdom in her judgment, before turning back to address the hall. It is decided, then. Marla Voss is stripped of all pack authority and rank, banished from noble court permanently, and ordered to return every stolen asset to Elena Voss, now recognized formally as rightful heir to the Voss estate in full. Diana Voss will serve a period of formal service within the kingdom's poorest districts, laboring among those she once looked down upon, until such time as genuine remorse can be demonstrated. Nora Voss will remain under strict probation, required to prove through consistent action that her silence will never again be chosen over courage. A murmur of approval rippled through the gathered nobles at the careful, deliberate nature of the judgment, several exchanging quiet remarks about the wisdom shown by a queen so newly introduced to court life. Even those who had arrived skeptical of Elena's suitability for the crown found themselves reconsidering their earlier doubts, watching a woman barely recovered from starvation render judgment with more nuance and fairness than many seasoned nobles might have managed under similar circumstances. The judgment landed heavily across the hall, and Marla's composure finally broke entirely, her carefully maintained mask of dignified grief collapsing into raw, undisguised panic as guards moved to escort her from the hall. Elena watched her go, expecting to feel triumph, or perhaps relief, but instead found only a quiet, settled peace, the sense of a long, exhausting chapter finally closing. Cale took her hand once the hall had begun to empty. The weight of judgment lifted from the air, replaced by something lighter, something that felt, for the first time, genuinely hopeful. You did well, he said quietly, fair and firm, and merciful in equal measure. That is the mark of a true queen, Elena, not simply the crown you'll eventually wear, but the wisdom you've already shown, in how you choose to wield the power you've been given. Elena leaned slightly into him, exhaustion and relief mingling together as the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly faded, grateful beyond measure that the hardest part of reclaiming her life now stood firmly behind her rather than ahead. "I still have so much to learn," she admitted. "We all do," Cale said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "But you've already proven, beyond any doubt, that you were always meant for more than that storage room ever allowed you to become." As the crowd dispersed and the great hall slowly emptied, Elena caught sight of Bettina waiting near a side entrance, her weathered face beaming with unrestrained pride. Elena crossed to her immediately, embracing her tightly, grateful beyond measure for the quiet kindness that had sustained her through her darkest days. "You spoke like a true queen already," Bettina murmured against her shoulder. "Your father would have been so proud, watching you stand there and reclaim everything that belonged to you." "I couldn't have survived long enough to reach this moment without you," Elena said, pulling back to meet the older woman's eyes. "Whatever position you'd like within this palace, name it, and it's yours." Bettina's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I only ever wanted to see you safe, child, nothing more." "Then let me give you more anyway," Elena said gently. "You've more than earned it." The weeks that followed brought a strange, quiet rhythm to Elena's new life within the palace. One built around healing rather than survival, around learning rather than merely enduring. Odette continued to monitor her physical recovery, gradually increasing her diet, until Elena had regained enough strength to move through her days without the constant fatigue that had shadowed her for years, not merely since the ball. But physical recovery, Elena quickly discovered, was the simpler part of healing. The deeper wounds, the ones left by years of neglect and calculated cruelty, did not mend so easily, and they revealed themselves in unexpected moments that caught her entirely off guard. One afternoon, several weeks after the confrontation in the Great Hall, a young palace servant accidentally spilled a tray of tea while serving Elena in the garden, the porcelain shattering against the stone path. Elena flinched violently, an old instinctive reaction born from years of associating mistakes with punishment, and found herself apologizing profusely to the startled servant, insisting the accident had been her own fault somehow, though she had done nothing at all. Cale, who had been sitting nearby reviewing reports from Ronan, set aside his papers immediately, watching the exchange with careful attention. Once the servant had cleared away the broken porcelain and retreated, visibly confused by Elena's excessive apologies, Cale reached for her hand. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said gently. "The tray slipped. It happens to everyone." "I know," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly. I don't know why I reacted like that." "You spent 3 years in a household where mistakes, even ones that weren't your own, brought consequences," Cale said quietly. "That kind of fear doesn't simply disappear because your circumstances have changed. It takes time, Elena. More time than either of us might wish, but time nonetheless." Elena appreciated his patience more than she could easily express, though it did little to erase the quiet shame she felt at her own reactions, the sense that some broken part of her remained, despite everything that had changed for the better. She began keeping a small journal, a habit Odette had suggested might help her track her own progress over time, a private space to record the moments when fear resurfaced unexpectedly, alongside the moments when she felt genuinely secure and at ease. Reading back through weeks of entries one quiet evening, she was surprised to find that the difficult moments, while still present, had grown noticeably less frequent, replaced increasingly by simple, unremarkable contentment, the kind that came from sharing a meal with Cale, or walking through the gardens without any particular agenda, or simply existing in a space where nothing was demanded of her beyond her own comfort. "You're improving," Cale observed one evening, glancing over her shoulder at the journal she had left open on a small table. "Even you can see it, written in your own hand." "I suppose I can," Elena admitted, a small, genuine smile crossing her face, one that came more easily now than it had in the early weeks of her recovery. She began to notice these moments more frequently, once she started paying attention, the way she instinctively calculated the least amount of space she could occupy in any room, the way she still sometimes forgot that she was permitted to simply ask for something, rather than waiting to see if it might be offered, the way she flinched, ever so slightly, whenever a door closed somewhat firmly nearby, some old, buried instinct associating the sound with being shut away. Odette noticed these patterns too, gently raising the subject during one of Elena's regular check-ins. Recovery from prolonged deprivation isn't only physical, the healer explained, settling into a chair across from Elena's favorite reading nook. The body heals according to fairly predictable timelines, given proper nourishment and rest. The mind often takes considerably longer, and the timeline rarely follows anything predictable at all. Will it always feel like this? Elena asked, unable to keep a note of weariness from her voice. Like I'm constantly bracing for something to go wrong, even when everything around me suggests otherwise? Not always, Odette said gently. But healing rarely moves in a straight line, Elena. You'll have days where you feel entirely secure, entirely confident in your new circumstances, and then something small and seemingly insignificant will remind you of the past, and the old fear will resurface, as though no time has passed at all. That's not failure. That's simply how minds heal from sustained hardship. Be patient with yourself, the same way you'd be patient with anyone else recovering from a serious injury. Elena absorbed this advice slowly, grateful for Odette's steady, practical wisdom, delivered without judgment or impatience. She had spent years believing that any lingering weakness reflected some fundamental flaw in her own character, and it took considerable effort to instead view her occasional setbacks as simply part of a longer, ongoing process, rather than evidence that she remained somehow permanently broken. She mentioned this to Cale one evening, as they walked together through the palace's private gardens beneath a sky scattered with stars. I don't know how to simply exist without bracing for something to go wrong, she admitted. I keep waiting for this to be temporary, for someone to tell me there's been a mistake and I need to return to how things were before. Nothing about this is temporary, Cale said firmly, stopping to face her directly. Elena, I understand the fear doesn't vanish overnight, and I'm not asking you to pretend it has. But I need you to understand something clearly. You are not a guest in this palace, waiting to be sent away the moment someone realizes an error has been made. You belong here. You belonged here from the moment my wolf recognized yours across that ballroom, and nothing about that truth is contingent on your recovery happening faster, or your fear disappearing sooner than it reasonably should. Elena studied his face in the moonlight, searching for any hint of impatience or hidden frustration, finding instead only steady, unwavering sincerity. How do you manage to be so patient? She asked softly. Because I've watched what real strength looks like these past few weeks, Cale said. It's not the absence of fear, Elena. It's continuing forward despite it. You stood in that hall and confronted the woman who controlled your life for 3 years, even while your hands were shaking. You've eaten every meal Odette has prescribed, even when your body wasn't entirely certain how to process regular nourishment again. You've asked questions about court politics and palace management, even when you felt completely out of your depth. That's not weakness, Elena. That's courage, practiced daily, in ways most people never have to demonstrate. Elena considered his words carefully, turning them over in her mind the way she once might have turned over a scrap of bread, searching for any hidden catch, any condition attached to such generous praise. She found none, only the same steady sincerity she had come to associate with everything Cale said to her, and slowly, she allowed herself to simply accept the compliment, without immediately searching for the trap behind it. Elena felt tears rising unexpectedly, though these were different from the tears of grief and shock she had shed in the days immediately following her collapse. These felt like something closer to release, the slow, gradual unburdening of years, of believing herself fundamentally broken, fundamentally unworthy of the care now being offered to her so consistently. I want to believe you, she whispered. I'm trying to believe you. That's all I'm asking, Cale said, gently wiping away a tear with his thumb. Trying is enough, Elena. It will always be enough. Their conversation was interrupted by Ronan's approach, his expression carrying the particular blend of urgency and diplomacy that Elena had learned usually accompanied important palace business. Elena had come to recognize, over these past weeks, the particular rhythm of palace life, how quiet moments of rest were so frequently punctuated by matters requiring immediate royal attention. She no longer felt the sharp jolt of anxiety such interruptions had once triggered in her, having gradually learned to trust that Cale handled each new demand with the same steady composure regardless of its urgency, and that whatever challenge Ronan brought could generally be met without unraveling the fragile stability she had worked so hard to rebuild. Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty, Lady Elena. There's a matter requiring attention. Representatives from several allied packs have requested a formal audience, eager to meet the king's chosen mate before the formal coronation ceremony. Elena's stomach tightened with familiar anxiety, though it felt different now, more manageable than the paralyzing fear she might have experienced weeks earlier. How many representatives? A dozen packs have sent envoys, along with several curious, to simply witness the woman who has captured the Alpha King's attention so completely. Ronan's tone remained carefully neutral, though Elena could sense the underlying concern in his words. I understand if you'd prefer more time before facing such scrutiny. No, Elena said, surprising herself with her own certainty. I need to learn how to do this eventually. Better to begin now, while Kale is beside me to guide me through it, than to delay until the coronation itself, when the stakes will be considerably higher. Kale's expression warmed with quiet pride. Are you certain? I'm certain, Elena said, echoing the same words she had spoken before confronting Marla in the Great Hall, finding them easier to say this time, more natural, more like something she genuinely believed, rather than something she was forcing herself to declare. The audience with the Allied envoys, held 2 days later in one of the palace's smaller receiving halls, tested Elena's composure in entirely new ways. She fielded questions about her background with careful honesty, neither hiding the difficulties of her past, nor allowing them to define the entirety of her character. She listened attentively to concerns raised by pack leaders regarding trade agreements and territorial disputes, absorbing details that would have overwhelmed her weeks earlier, but now felt, if not entirely comfortable, at least manageable with practice. One elderly pack leader, representing a northern territory long allied with the Ashbourne crown, studied Elena with evident curiosity throughout the audience, waiting until the formal proceedings concluded before approaching her directly. Forgive an old wolf's bluntness, he said, but I confess I expected someone different, given the circumstances of your discovery. I expected perhaps someone more fragile, or more overwhelmed by sudden circumstance. He studied her for a long moment, his weathered features difficult to read, before continuing. I've served this crown through 3 different reigns, my lady, and I've watched more than a few noble daughters arrive at court entirely unprepared for the demands placed upon them, despite a lifetime of supposed preparation. You arrive with considerably less preparation, and yet somehow considerably more presence than most I've encountered. Elena met his gaze steadily. I understand the expectation. I was, until recently, exactly the fragile, overwhelmed person you describe. But circumstances change people, sometimes for the worse, and sometimes, if we're fortunate enough to receive the right support, for the better. The old pack leader studied her for a long moment, before offering a slow, approving nod. The Ashbourne crown chose well, it seems, whatever unusual circumstances led to that choice. Other envoys approached throughout the afternoon, some with genuine curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. They attempted, not always successfully, to mask behind polite conversation. A younger representative from a coastal pack pressed her with pointed questions about her qualifications to manage a kingdom's worth of diplomatic obligations, questions clearly designed to expose whatever gaps existed in her education. Elena answered each one honestly, acknowledging areas where her knowledge remained incomplete, while demonstrating a clear grasp of the underlying principles at stake, an approach that seemed to earn her more respect than false confidence would have managed. By the time the final envoy departed, Elena felt the particular exhaustion that came from hours of sustained mental effort, the kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with her body's recovery from hunger, and everything to do with the genuine labor of learning an entirely new role under intense scrutiny. After the envoys departed, Elena found herself unexpectedly proud of how the audience had unfolded, a small but significant victory in her ongoing effort to reclaim confidence and agency she had once believed permanently lost. She thought back to the girl who had once measured her own worth by how invisible she could make herself, who had learned to shrink and quiet herself in every room she entered, and marveled at the distance she had already traveled toward becoming someone capable of standing before foreign dignitaries and answering their pointed questions without flinching. The transformation had not happened overnight, and she suspected it would continue unfolding for months or even years to come. But the progress already visible gave her genuine hope that the frightened, starving girl from that storage room was not the whole of who she was destined to become. Kale noticed the shift in her posture immediately as they walked together back toward their private quarters. You handled that beautifully, he said. Every question, every concern, addressed with exactly the right balance of honesty and diplomacy. I was terrified the entire time, Elena admitted, a small laugh escaping despite herself. Terrified and magnificent are not mutually exclusive, Cale said, smiling warmly. In fact, I'd argue the truest displays of courage always involve at least a little terror. Faced anyway, met anyway, overcome anyway. Elena leaned into him slightly, feeling, for the first time since arriving at the palace, something that felt remarkably close to genuine confidence. Not the absence of fear entirely, but the growing, steady belief that whatever challenges lay ahead, she possessed the strength to meet them, particularly with Cale steady and unwavering beside her. Preparations for the coronation began in earnest as autumn settled over the kingdom, the palace grounds transforming, with each passing week, into something increasingly grand and ceremonial. Elena found herself swept into an endless series of fittings, etiquette lessons, and briefings on kingdom history, each day bringing new information that felt, at times, impossibly overwhelming. The royal seamstresses, a small team of exacting women led by a sharp-eyed elder named Marigold, measured and remeasured Elena's gown over the course of several weeks, adjusting for the weight she had steadily regained since her collapse, each fitting session serving as its own quiet marker of how far her recovery had progressed. Marigold, gruff but ultimately kind, had taken a particular liking to Elena, often sharing small stories about previous Ashbourne queens while she worked, offering Elena a broader sense of the history and tradition she was now becoming part of. Queen Isolde, 2 generations back, insisted on redesigning half the ceremonial protocols within her first year, Marigold mentioned one afternoon, pins clenched between her teeth as she adjusted a hem. Everyone said it couldn't be done. That tradition was too deeply rooted to change. She proved them all wrong, simply because she refused to accept that things had to stay exactly as they'd always been. Elena found comfort in such stories, small proof that the role she was stepping into had room enough for her own particular strengths and priorities, that queenship need not require erasing everything unique about herself in favor of rigid, unchanging tradition. Odette had long since cleared her for full physical activity, her body fully recovered from the effects of prolonged hunger, though Elena privately suspected certain habits from those difficult years might never entirely fade. She still finished every meal completely, unable to leave food unfinished on her plate, a small but persistent reminder of years when nothing had ever been guaranteed. Between fittings, Elena spent considerable time in briefings with palace scholars, absorbing the history of previous reigns, the intricate web of alliances that held the kingdom's various pacts together, and the delicate customs expected of her during the ceremony itself. She approached each lesson with the same quiet determination that had carried her through years of hardship, treating every new piece of information as another tool she might one day use to genuinely help the people now depending on her judgment. One afternoon, exhausted from hours spent memorizing the names and territories of every allied pack leader who would attend the coronation, Elena retreated to the palace library, seeking a quiet moment away from the constant demands of preparation. She had not expected to find Diana there, seated near the far window, a stack of books beside her, dressed in the plain, undyed clothing now required of her ongoing service within the kingdom's poorer districts. Elena paused in the doorway, old wariness rising instinctively at the sight of her former stepsister. Diana looked up, and something in her expression, tired and subdued in a way Elena had never witnessed before, gave her pause before retreating. "I didn't expect to see you here," Elena said carefully. "I'm not permitted much free time," Diana replied, closing the book in her lap. "But Ronan allows me an hour occasionally, provided I've completed my assigned duties. I've been trying to educate myself, since apparently I know considerably less about genuine hardship than I once assumed." Elena studied her former stepsister carefully, uncertain how to interpret this unexpected humility from a woman who had spent years mocking her without apparent remorse. "How has your service been?" she noticed, as she asked the question that some part of her genuinely wanted to know, wanted to understand whether the person sitting across from her had truly changed or was simply performing contrition for practical benefit. She had spent enough years reading the moods and motivations of everyone in the Voss household, a survival skill born of necessity, that she trusted her own instincts more than she once might have, and something in Diana's posture, tired in a way that seemed to run deeper than mere physical exhaustion, suggested genuine reflection, rather than calculated performance. Difficult, Diana admitted. I spent 3 days last week helping tend to families who've lost everything to flooding along the eastern rivers, children who haven't eaten properly in weeks, mothers exhausted beyond anything I've ever experienced. She paused, something flickering across her expression that looked remarkably like shame. I kept thinking of you, Elena, of the storage room, of the meals. I mocked you for eating gratefully. I never understood, not really, what actual hunger felt like, what it meant to genuinely fear where your next meal might come from. Elena remained silent, uncertain whether Diana's apparent remorse was genuine or simply a performance calculated to improve her circumstances. Old caution warred with a cautious hope that perhaps, given enough time and genuine consequence, people could actually change. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Diana continued quietly. I don't believe I've earned that yet, and perhaps I never will. But I wanted you to know that I understand now, in ways I refused to understand before, exactly how much harm I caused you. I was cruel because it was easy, because you never fought back, because Mother rewarded cruelty and I wanted her approval, more than I wanted to be decent. Diana glanced down at her hands, work-worn now in a way they had never been during her years of privilege. There was a boy in that eastern district, no older than 6, who asked me why his stomach hurt so much all the time. I didn't have an answer for him beyond the truth, that hunger simply hurts, and that no amount of pretending otherwise makes it hurt any less. I kept thinking, the entire walk back to where I was staying, that I had asked you similar questions once, mockingly, expecting you to break down in front of me. I never once considered that I was asking about something that genuinely hurt, that I was mocking actual suffering rather than performed weakness. Elena listened in silence, uncertain what to make of this confession, torn between old resentment and a cautious recognition that perhaps genuine understanding was beginning to take root where none had existed before. What will you do, she asked finally, once your period of service concludes? I don't know yet, Diana admitted. Ronan mentioned the possibility of continuing on in some formal capacity, working directly with the districts rather than simply serving out a sentence. I think I'd like that, if it's permitted. I don't know how to undo what I've done, but I'd like to spend considerably more time trying to do some good, rather than simply waiting out my punishment until I'm allowed to return to my old life. That's not an excuse, Elena said, though her voice carried less anger than it might have weeks earlier. I know, Diana said. It's not meant to be an excuse. It's meant to be an acknowledgement, the beginning of actually taking responsibility, rather than simply accepting punishment, because I have no other choice. Elena considered this for a long moment, weighing years of accumulated resentment against the possibility, however uncertain, of genuine change. I don't know if I can trust you, she said finally. Not yet, and perhaps not for a long time. I understand, Diana said. I don't expect trust. I only hope, eventually, to earn something less than the complete contempt I likely deserve. They sat in silence for a while longer, an uneasy but not entirely hostile quiet settling between them, before Elena eventually rose to leave, uncertain what to make of the conversation, but recognizing, at minimum, that something had shifted, however slightly, in the dynamic that had once defined their entire relationship. She mentioned the encounter to Cale later that evening, watching his expression carefully as she recounted Diana's apparent remorse. Do you think it's genuine? She asked. I don't know, Cale admitted. People are capable of both genuine change and convincing performance, and it's not always easy to distinguish between the two, particularly in someone's early attempts at reform. But her assigned service has been rigorous, and reports from the districts confirm she's worked diligently, without complaint, in conditions considerably harder than anything she's previously experienced. What do you think I should do? Elena asked. I think you should do whatever feels right to you, without pressure from me or anyone else, Cale said. You don't owe Diana forgiveness, regardless of how genuine her remorse might be. But if you find, over time, that you want to extend some measure of grace, that choice belongs entirely to you, made on your own timeline, for your own reasons. Elena appreciated, as she often did, Cale's consistent refusal to push her toward any particular resolution, his steady insistence that her choices, particularly regarding matters that had caused her such profound pain, remained entirely her own to make. I think I need more time, she said finally. Perhaps months, perhaps longer, before I know how I truly feel. She had noticed, these past weeks, how differently Cale approached every difficult decision, compared to how Marla had once handled even the smallest household matters. Where Marla had ruled through fear and unpredictability, never allowing Elena to anticipate what consequence any given action might bring, Cale consistently offered her the space to choose her own path, trusting her judgment, even in matters as fraught as forgiving those who had wronged her most deeply. That consistency, more than any single grand gesture, had become the foundation of the trust slowly rebuilding itself within her. Then take that time, Cale said simply. There's no deadline on healing, Elena, and no obligation to forgive faster than genuinely feels right to you. As the coronation approached, Elena found herself increasingly preoccupied, not merely with the logistics of the ceremony itself, but with deeper questions about the kind of queen she hoped to become. She spent hours in the palace library, studying the history of previous queens, noting which had been remembered for compassion and wisdom, and which had been remembered, less favorably, for cruelty or indifference toward those beneath their station. I want to establish something, she told Cale one evening, several weeks before the scheduled coronation. A program, perhaps, dedicated to identifying and assisting others who might be suffering similar neglect within their own households, particularly among daughters and wards who lack the power or standing to advocate for themselves. She had spent several sleepless nights turning the idea over in her mind, initially uncertain whether such an ambition was appropriate for someone still so new to her role, still learning the basic mechanics of court and governance. But the more she considered the years of suffering she had endured, invisible to anyone with actual power to intervene, the more convinced she became that her unique position, straddling both the experience of genuine hardship and the newfound authority of the crown, gave her an opportunity few others in the kingdom's history had ever possessed. Cale's expression brightened with genuine enthusiasm. That's an excellent idea, Elena. What did you have in mind specifically? I'm not entirely certain yet, Elena admitted. But I keep thinking of Bettina, of the small kindnesses she risked to help me, and I wonder how many others might exist in similar situations, trapped in households where cruelty hides behind respectable appearances, with no one positioned to notice or intervene. Then let's build something together, Cale said. A formal office, perhaps, empowered to investigate reports of household neglect and abuse, with resources dedicated to supporting victims once their circumstances are uncovered. You understand, better than anyone in this palace, exactly what such a program needs to accomplish. Elena felt a swelling sense of purpose at the prospect, the first time since her arrival at the palace that she had considered her own painful history as something that might ultimately serve a greater good, rather than simply a wound to be quietly healed and set aside. I'd like Bettina to help design it, she said. She understood what was happening to me, long before anyone with actual power took notice. Her insight would be invaluable. Then we'll bring her to the palace, Cale said. Whatever resources and support she needs, she'll have them. Elena spent the following days sketching out early ideas for the program, filling page after page with notes about what such an office would actually need to function effectively. She thought about the specific obstacles that had kept her own suffering hidden for so long, the careful appearances Marla had maintained, the fear that had kept servants like Bettina cautious about how openly they could intervene, the simple lack of any formal channel through which concerns might be raised without risking retaliation. It needs teeth, she told Cale one evening, reviewing her notes by candlelight. Not merely the authority to investigate, but genuine consequences for those found responsible, and genuine protection for anyone who comes forward with information. Otherwise it becomes just another office that exists on paper without actually changing anything for the people who need it most. Agreed, Cale said. I'll have Ronan draft formal legal authority granting the office full investigative power, along with protections against retaliation, for any servant or witness who provides testimony in good faith. Elena nodded, satisfaction settling over her at the prospect of building something genuinely useful from the wreckage of her own painful history. It felt, in some strange way, like the first truly constructive thing she had been able to offer since arriving at the palace, proof that her presence here amounted to more than simply the fortunate beneficiary of an unlikely mate bond. Elena smiled, genuine warmth spreading through her chest at the thought of finally being able to offer something meaningful in return for kindnesses once shown to her during her darkest days. The coronation, still weeks away, suddenly felt less like an intimidating ceremonial obligation and more like the true beginning of something she had never quite dared to imagine for herself. A chance not merely to survive, but to genuinely help others avoid the suffering she had endured for far too long. Bettina arrived at the palace on a crisp morning 2 weeks before the coronation, her weathered face breaking into astonished tears the moment she saw Elena waiting to greet her at the main gate, dressed now in fine clothing that bore no resemblance to the ragged servant she had once smuggled bread to beneath a locked door. The journey from the Voss estate had clearly been long and tiring. Bettina's small traveling case worn at the corners, her boots dusty from the road, but nothing about her exhaustion diminished the pure, unguarded joy that lit her face at the sight of Elena standing tall and healthy before her. Several palace guards, unaccustomed to seeing their new queen, rushed forward so eagerly to embrace an elderly servant woman, exchanged bemused glances, though none dared comment on the unusual scene unfolding at the main gate. "Child," Bettina whispered, pulling Elena into an embrace that neither seemed inclined to end quickly. "Look at you! I always knew there was something special in you, even when you were sleeping on those thin blankets, but I never dared imagine anything like this. I wouldn't have survived without you," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "Those 3 days before the ball, that bread you brought me, it kept me steady enough to make it through. I've never properly thanked you." "You don't owe me thanks," Bettina said, wiping her eyes. "Any decent person would have done the same. It's the ones who didn't, who watched and said nothing for years, who owe apologies that will likely never come." Elena led her inside, explaining the program she hoped to build, watching Bettina's expression shift from surprise to genuine excitement as she grasped the scope of what Elena envisioned. "You want to find others like you," Bettina said slowly. "Girls trapped the way you were, invisible to everyone except the people causing them harm." "Exactly," Elena said. "And I want servants like you, people who see what actually happens behind closed doors, to have a proper channel to report concerns, without fear of losing their position or facing retaliation for speaking up." Bettina's new quarters within the palace were modest but comfortable, a small suite near the eastern wing that Elena had personally selected, wanting to ensure the older woman felt genuinely welcomed, rather than simply relocated for the sake of convenience. Bettina had wept again upon seeing the space, insisting repeatedly that such comfort was far more than she deserved, and Elena had gently but firmly reminded her that 18 years of loyal service, culminating in genuine risk taken on Elena's behalf, deserved considerably more recognition than a single comfortable room could ever fully repay. Over the following days, Elena and Bettina worked closely together, drafting the framework for what would eventually become known throughout the kingdom as the Voss Initiative, a formal office dedicated to investigating reports of household neglect, empowered to remove vulnerable individuals from dangerous situations and provide them with resources to rebuild their lives. Kale provided the necessary authority and funding, while Ronan helped structure the practical mechanisms of investigation and intervention. But the vision, the deep, informed understanding of exactly what such victims needed, came entirely from Elena and Bettina's shared experience. "I want servants to know they can come forward," Elena explained during one planning session, "without fear that speaking up will cost them their livelihood. Bettina risked everything bringing me that bread. No one should have to risk that much simply to show basic decency toward someone suffering." Ronan, who had joined the planning session to advise on the legal framework, suggested formally naming the office after Elena's own family line, a gesture meant to honor both her personal history and the transformation of that history into something meant to protect others. Elena had hesitated initially, uncertain whether attaching her own name to the effort might seem self-serving, but Bettina had gently persuaded her otherwise. "Let them know exactly whose story inspired it," Bettina said. "Let every servant who hears the name Voss from now on think first of the woman who turned her own suffering into their protection, rather than the woman who caused it." The work gave Elena a renewed sense of purpose in the weeks leading up to her coronation, transforming what had once felt like an overwhelming, imposed obligation into something she genuinely looked forward to each day. She began receiving reports, cautiously at first, from servants and neighbors across various packs who had witnessed troubling situations but lacked the standing or resources to intervene effectively on their own. The first several reports proved relatively minor, misunderstandings, or exaggerated concerns that, upon investigation, revealed nothing beyond ordinary household friction. Elena had worried, briefly, that the initiative might prove more trouble than it was worth, drawing complaints without substance, while wasting resources better directed elsewhere. But Bettina had counseled patience, reminding her that even the false alarms served a purpose, establishing trust in the system itself, proving to servants and vulnerable wards across the kingdom that their concerns would be taken seriously, rather than dismissed outright. By the fourth week, the reports had grown more substantive and more troubling. A case involving a young widow's stepson, denied his inheritance in a pattern eerily similar to Elena's own experience, resulted in swift intervention once Ronan's investigators confirmed the account. Another case, involving an elderly servant denied proper medical care after decades of loyal service, led to formal reprimand against the pack responsible, and a mandate ensuring the servant received the treatment and pension she was owed. One evening, reviewing a particularly difficult report with Kale regarding a young ward suffering similar neglect within a distant pack's household, Elena found herself overwhelmed by the sheer scope of suffering that had apparently existed, hidden and unaddressed, throughout the kingdom for years. The report detailed months of careful observation by a concerned neighbor, cross-referenced against testimony from two former household servants who had since found employment elsewhere, painting a picture disturbingly familiar to Elena's own experience. She read through the pages slowly, her hands tightening around the parchment, as details emerged that mirrored her own suffering almost precisely. The deliberate isolation, the calculated cruelty, disguised as discipline, the quiet, persistent hunger that no one outside the household had thought to question. How did no one notice any of this before? She asked, setting the report aside with visible distress. How many people suffered exactly as I did, with no one positioned to help them? Kale reached for her hand, understanding the weight of her question. Cruelty often hides well, particularly when perpetrated by those skilled at maintaining respectable appearances. That's precisely why the work you're building matters so much, Elena. You're creating the very system that should have existed to protect you, and now it will exist to protect countless others who might otherwise have suffered in silence. Elena absorbed this, finding some measure of peace in the knowledge that her own painful history, however much she still carried its weight, was becoming the foundation for genuine, lasting change. I want to visit that household myself, she said. The one in the report. I want to see the situation firsthand, and I want that young girl to know that someone with actual power believes her and intends to help. Kale studied her carefully. Are you certain you're ready for that? It's likely to bring back difficult memories of your own experience. I'm certain, Elena said, echoing words that had become something of a personal anthem these past months, a declaration of resolve she had learned to trust in herself increasingly over time. If I'm going to build something meaningful, I need to be willing to face the difficult parts directly, not simply oversee the process from a comfortable distance. They traveled together 3 days later, Kale insisting on accompanying her despite Elena's assurance that she could manage the visit alone. The household in question, belonging to a minor pack several days' journey from the Ashbourne Palace, bore an unsettling resemblance to the Voss estate, and Elena felt old, familiar anxiety rising as they approached the modest manor house. The journey itself gave Elena considerable time to reflect on how much her circumstances had changed since the last time she had traveled such a distance, recalling the jostling servant's wagon that had carried her toward the mating ball months earlier, weak and starving, and utterly without hope. This time she traveled in comfort, accompanied by a man who had proven, through consistent action rather than empty promise, that he genuinely valued her well-being, and armed with the authority and resources to actually change another young girl's circumstances, rather than simply enduring her own suffering in silence. The pack leader responsible for Poppy's care, a distant cousin who had taken guardianship following the death of her parents, greeted the king's arrival with visible nervousness, clearly aware that royal visits of this nature rarely brought good news for those under investigation. Kale addressed him directly, his tone measured but unmistakably firm, informing him that formal charges would follow once the investigation concluded, and that in the meantime, Poppy would be removed from his care immediately for her own protection. The young ward, a girl named Poppy who could not have been more than 14 years old, greeted them with visible confusion and fear, clearly unaccustomed to receiving visitors of such standing, let alone the king himself accompanied by his newly claimed mate. Elena knelt to meet her at eye level, speaking gently, drawing on her own painful memories to guide the conversation, with careful, informed compassion. "I know this feels frightening," Elena said softly. "I know you've likely been told that no one would believe you, or that speaking up would only bring worse consequences. I understand that fear better than most people ever could." Poppy's eyes widened slightly. "How could you understand?" "Because I lived it," Elena said simply. "For 3 years, in my own stepmother's household, I was denied proper food, forced to sleep in a converted storage room, and told repeatedly that speaking up would only make my circumstances worse. I understand exactly how frightening it feels to trust someone with the truth of your situation, particularly when every previous experience has taught you that trust only leads to further harm." Tears welled in Poppy's eyes, and slowly, haltingly, she began to share her own story, details that confirmed the report Elena had reviewed, and revealed additional cruelties that had gone previously undocumented. She spoke of being denied schooling that other children in the household received freely, of being made to work long hours in the kitchens while still expected to maintain appearances during rare public occasions, of a loneliness so complete that she had begun talking to herself simply to hear a voice that did not carry criticism or command. "I used to imagine my parents would come back for me," Poppy admitted quietly, "even though I know they passed years ago. I used to imagine someone, anyone, would eventually notice and decide I deserved something better than this." "Someone has noticed," Elena said gently, "and you do deserve something better, Poppy. You deserved it every single day you were denied it, and you deserve it now, starting today." Cale watched the exchange from a respectful distance, remaining quiet throughout most of the conversation, allowing Elena's informed, gentle guidance to carry the weight of the moment, without royal authority, overshadowing the intimacy of genuine understanding, passing between two people who had endured remarkably similar suffering. Elena listened with patient, informed attention, occasionally offering gentle reassurance, never once rushing the conversation, or pressing for details Poppy seemed hesitant to share. By the time they departed several hours later, arrangements had been made to remove Poppy from the household immediately, with formal charges to follow against the pack members responsible for her treatment. Poppy would be relocated to a program Elena and Bettina had established specifically for such situations, offering education, proper care, and eventually, the resources needed to build an independent, secure future. "You handled that beautifully," Cale said, as their carriage began the journey back toward the Ashbourne Palace. "It was harder than I expected," Elena admitted, exhaustion evident in her voice. Hearing her story, it brought back memories I'd hoped were beginning to fade. "That's understandable," Cale said gently. "But you gave her something invaluable today, Elena. Not merely rescue from a dangerous situation, but genuine understanding. The knowledge that someone with actual power had walked the same difficult path she was currently walking, and had survived it, and had built something meaningful from that survival." Elena leaned against him, exhaustion and quiet satisfaction mingling together as the carriage rolled steadily homeward. "I think this is what I want my reign to be defined by," she said softly. "Not merely the ceremony of the crown, but this. Actually reaching people who need help. Actually building something that prevents the suffering I endured from continuing unchecked for others." "Then that's exactly what your reign will be defined by," Cale said, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple. "I have no doubt whatsoever, Elena, that you're going to be remembered as one of the finest queens this kingdom has ever known, precisely because you never forgot what genuine suffering feels like, even after your own circumstances changed so completely." Elena closed her eyes, allowing herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to feel genuinely proud of the woman she was becoming, no longer defined by the hunger and neglect of her past, but increasingly defined by the compassion and purpose she was actively choosing to build from those difficult years, transforming pain into something that would genuinely help others for years to come. The carriage rolled on through the darkening countryside, and Elena found herself thinking of Poppy, likely already settling into her new quarters at the program's central house, surrounded for the first time by adults specifically trained to notice and address whatever fears still lingered beneath her cautious silence. She thought too of all the others still waiting to be found, still enduring circumstances she could scarcely bear to imagine, and made a quiet, private vow to herself that she would never allow the work of the initiative to slow, regardless of how demanding her other royal duties might become in the years ahead. The morning of the coronation arrived crisp and clear, sunlight streaming across the palace grounds where thousands had gathered, representatives from every allied pack across the kingdom, assembled to witness the ceremony that would formally crown Elena Voss as queen beside Cale Ashbourne. Elena had woken well before dawn, unable to sleep, despite the exhaustion of the previous week's preparations, her mind cycling through memories of everything that had led her to this moment. She thought of the storage room, the careful rationing of water, the 3 days of hunger that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, delivered her to this extraordinary new life. She thought of her father, of the promises he had made about the woman she might become, promises that had once seemed impossibly distant and now felt, remarkably, on the verge of fulfillment. Elena stood in her private chamber, studying her reflection in the tall mirror, scarcely recognizing the woman staring back at her. Gone was any trace of the starving, invisible servant who had collapsed on a ballroom floor months earlier. In her place stood someone steady, confident, dressed in shimmering ivory silk, embroidered with delicate silver thread, her dark hair arranged in an elegant crown of braids that would soon be joined by an actual crown, symbolizing everything she had reclaimed and rebuilt since that fateful night. Bettina, who had become something between advisor and cherished family these past months, adjusted the final details of Elena's gown, tears glistening in her eyes. "Your father would be so proud of you," she said softly. "I only wish he could see this moment." Elena felt her own eyes sting at the mention of her father, the memories of his love and protection that had sustained her, however faintly, through the darkest years following his death. "I think he does see it somehow," she said quietly. "I think he's been watching this entire time, waiting for the moment I finally reclaimed everything Marla tried to steal from me." A soft knock interrupted the moment, and Elena turned to find Diana standing hesitantly in the doorway, dressed in simple but respectable clothing, a visible change from the plain servant's garb she had worn throughout her assigned service these past months. "I wasn't certain I'd be welcome here," Diana said carefully. "But I wanted to see you before the ceremony, if you'll permit it." Elena studied her former stepsister, noting genuine changes in her bearing these past months, a humility and thoughtfulness that had not existed in the confident, dismissive girl who had once mocked Elena's suffering so casually. "You're welcome," Elena said finally. "Come in." Behind Diana, hovering uncertainly near the doorway, Nora waited as well, dressed simply, her earlier probation apparently concluded, given her presence at the palace at all. Elena caught sight of her and gestured for her to enter as well. "I wasn't certain you'd want me here," Nora said quietly, once she had stepped inside. "I know my silence caused you as much harm as Diana's cruelty, even if it looked different from the outside." "I know," Elena said simply. "I haven't forgotten that, Nora. But I also remember that you never actively participated in the worst of it, and I've heard from Ronan that your probation has gone well, that you've shown genuine effort toward becoming someone who speaks up rather than simply watches." "I'm trying," Nora said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every day, I'm trying to be someone who would have helped you, back then, instead of someone who stayed quiet out of fear." Elena studied her for a long moment, this stepsister, who had never actively tormented her, but had never once intervened either, whose crime had been cowardice rather than cruelty, and found herself extending a small, tentative measure of grace. "Trying counts for something," she said. "Keep trying, Nora. That's all I ask." Diana stepped forward, clutching something small in her hands. "I wanted to give you this, before the ceremony. It belonged to your father, actually. I found it among some old belongings during my service, and I thought you should have it, rather than it remaining forgotten in storage." She held out a small, delicate pendant, one Elena recognized immediately from faded childhood memories, a piece her father had once worn constantly, a symbol of the Voss pack passed down through generations, before Marla had seemingly disposed of every remaining trace of Edmund Voss's memory. "Thank you," Elena whispered, accepting the pendant with trembling hands, memories of her father flooding back with unexpected intensity. "This means more than you could possibly know." "I know I don't deserve your gratitude," Diana said quietly, "but I wanted to do something right, something that might begin to make amends for everything I failed to do when it actually mattered." Elena studied her for a long moment, weighing months of accumulated healing against the complicated, ongoing question of forgiveness. "It's a start," she said finally. "Perhaps, in time, it could become more than that." Diana's eyes filled with tears, evident relief and gratitude in her expression. "That's more than I hoped for," she said. Thank you, Elena. For everything. But especially for allowing me the chance to try, even after everything I did. The moment was interrupted by Ronan's arrival, announcing that the ceremony was ready to begin. Elena took a steadying breath, fastening her father's pendant carefully around her neck, feeling its familiar weight settle against her chest, like a promise finally fulfilled. Outside, the palace grounds had been transformed entirely, banners bearing the Ashbourne crest, hanging alongside newly designed banners, incorporating elements of the Voss family symbol, a deliberate gesture from Kale, honoring Elena's own heritage, rather than erasing it entirely, in favor of the crown she was joining. Musicians filled the air with ceremonial music as Elena stepped out into the autumn sunlight, the crowd's collective gasp of admiration rippling outward the moment she appeared. She caught sight of familiar faces scattered among the assembled representatives, the elderly pack leader from the Northern Territory who had questioned her fitness for the role during that early audience, now watching with what appeared to be genuine approval. Poppy stood near the front of the crowd, dressed in a fine new gown, waving enthusiastically the moment she spotted Elena, and Elena felt her heart swell at the sight of the young girl, who had found safety and hope through the very program Elena had built from her own painful history. The walk toward the ceremonial dais felt, to Elena, like the culmination of everything she had endured and overcome these past months. Thousands of faces turned to watch as she processed slowly through the assembled crowd, no longer the invisible servant girl mocked and overlooked, but a woman fully claiming her rightful place, flanked by the strength of everything she had rebuilt from the ashes of her former life. Kale waited for her at the dais, resplendent in ceremonial robes, his golden eyes warm with unmistakable pride as she approached. He extended his hand, and Elena took it without hesitation, climbing the final steps to stand beside him before the entire assembled kingdom. The high priestess, an elderly wolf named Cordelia who had presided over Ashbourne coronations for decades, began the ceremonial rites, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. We gather today to witness the joining of Kale Ashbourne, Alpha King of this kingdom, and Elena Voss, chosen mate through bonds older than memory itself, and to crown her formally as queen, protector, and partner in all matters of this realm. Cordelia's voice, though softened by age, carried an unmistakable authority that silenced even the faint rustling of ceremonial banners in the autumn breeze. She had performed this rite only twice before in her long service to the crown, and something in her measured cadence suggested she understood, perhaps better than anyone else present, the full weight and rarity of the moment unfolding before the assembled kingdom. Elena listened to the familiar words of the ceremony, her heart swelling with emotions too complex to easily name, gratitude and pride, and lingering disbelief, all intertwining, as the moment finally arrived. Cordelia lifted the ceremonial crown, delicate silver work studded with small glittering gems, and placed it gently atop Elena's head. "Rise, Queen Elena Ashbourne," Cordelia announced, chosen mate of the Alpha King, protector of this realm, and guardian of all who might otherwise go unheard within its borders. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, thousands of voices rising together in celebration, and Elena felt tears finally spill freely down her cheeks. No longer tears of grief or fear, but tears of overwhelming joy at everything she had reclaimed, everything she had rebuilt, everything she was now poised to become. Kale turned to her, his expression radiant with pride and love, cupping her face gently in his hands. "My queen," he said softly, words meant only for her, despite the celebrating crowd surrounding them. "I have never been prouder of anyone in my entire life." "We did this together," Elena said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have found my way back to myself without you standing beside me every step of the way." "You found your own way back," Kale corrected gently. "I simply had the privilege of witnessing it, and standing beside you while you did." He thought back to the moment he had first caught her scent across that crowded ballroom, certain in that instant that his life had irrevocably changed, though he could never have predicted just how profoundly. He had expected, if he expected anything at all, that finding his mate would simply complete something missing in his own life. He had not expected to be so thoroughly transformed himself, to learn patience and gentleness in ways his years of ruling had never quite required of him, to discover that love, real love, asked considerably more of a person than mere recognition and claim. He leaned down, pressing a gentle, reverent kiss to her lips, and the crowd's applause swelled even louder, celebrating not merely the formal joining of their king and queen, but the remarkable, inspiring journey that had led them to this moment, a testament to resilience, triumphing over cruelty, and love, triumphing over years of calculated neglect. In the months that followed, Queen Elena Ashbourne would become known throughout the kingdom, not merely for the dramatic circumstances of her discovery, but for the compassionate, tireless work she dedicated herself to, expanding the Voss initiative into every corner of the realm, ensuring that no child, no servant, no forgotten daughter would ever again suffer in silence the way she once had. Within the first year of her reign, the initiative had grown to include a network of trained investigators stationed across every major territory, along with a system of anonymous reporting that allowed servants and witnesses to raise concerns without fear of immediate identification. Poppy, now thriving under the program's care, had begun training as one of the initiative's youngest advocates, determined to help other children navigate the frightening process of coming forward with their own difficult truths. Diana, true to her word, had requested and received a permanent position overseeing relief efforts in the kingdom's poorest districts, her early defensiveness having given way, gradually, to genuine dedication that even Elena had come to respect. Nora, quieter in her contributions, had become one of the initiative's most reliable case reviewers, her careful, methodical attention to detail proving invaluable in verifying reports before formal investigations began. Marla Voss, stripped of rank and banished from noble court, was rarely spoken of within the palace walls, her name having become, over time, less a source of lingering anger and more a distant memory of a chapter firmly closed. Elena found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she thought of her former stepmother less and less as the months passed, her energy increasingly consumed by the meaningful work of building something better, rather than dwelling on the woman who had once tried so hard to diminish her. She thought often, in quiet moments, of the frightened girl who had once measured water in careful sips, uncertain when her next meal might arrive, uncertain if anyone in the world genuinely cared for her well-being. That girl had not disappeared entirely, some part of her remaining forever within Elena's heart, a permanent reminder of exactly how far she had traveled, and exactly why her work now mattered so deeply. But standing now as queen, beloved by her people, cherished completely by the king who had recognized her worth, the very moment her scent had reached him across a crowded ballroom, Elena understood, with complete and settled certainty, that she had finally become everything she had once believed impossible, no longer forgotten, no longer starved of love or dignity or basic human kindness. She was Queen Elena Ashbourne, chosen not despite her painful history, but in some profound way, because of the strength that history had forged within her, and she intended to spend the rest of her reign ensuring that strength served every single person within her kingdom who still needed someone powerful enough and compassionate enough to finally hear them. Years later, when historians and storytellers spoke of Queen Elena Ashbourne's remarkable reign, they would speak first of the Voss Initiative and the countless lives it touched, of the systematic dismantling of cruelty that so often hid behind respectable appearances across the kingdom. They would speak, too, of a queen who never forgot the taste of hunger, who measured every policy and every judgment against the memory of a girl once locked away with nothing but a cracked jug of water and a single dwindling candle. But those who knew her most intimately, Kale chief among them, would remember something simpler still, the quiet, steady courage of a woman who had refused to let her worst days define the entirety of who she might yet become, and who had transformed that refusal into a legacy that would outlast them both.